Yo, what's up, everyone? It's the Potter Show, and today we're checking out. What if Harry collapsed during the sorting and his magic screamed every name of person who hurt him to entire Great Hall? Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1. The screaming candles were the first thing Harry noticed about the Great Hall, not the bewitched ceiling rolling with storm-gray clouds. Not the 4 long tables packed with students craning their necks to stare at him, but the candles. Hundreds of them, floating without any visible means of support, burning without melting down to nothing, just hanging there in defiance of every physical law he'd ever been taught to accept. He stood in the cluster of first years being herded toward the front of the hall and thought, so it's all real, then. Every word on the train. Every impossible thing he'd seen since Hagrid knocked down the door of the hut on the rock. All of it real. The hall smelled of roast chicken and warm bread and something underneath both, something older, like stone that had been breathing for 1,000 years. Harry's stomach turned over, though not from hunger. He hadn't eaten much on the train. He hadn't been able to sit still long enough. Move along, move along! Professor McGonagall's voice carried the particular quality of someone who had done this exactly the same way for 30 years and had no intention of changing. She walked with a scroll tucked under her arm and her hat arrow straight on her head, and the first years shuffled after her like ducklings who understood, instinctively, that falling behind would be a mistake. Harry kept close to Ron, who had been the first person his age to ever look at him like he was interesting rather than strange. Ron was gawping at the ceiling with his mouth slightly open. "It's bewitched," Hermione Granger said, from somewhere just behind Harry's left shoulder, her voice carrying the crisp satisfaction of someone deploying a fact they'd been waiting to use. "To look like the sky outside. I read about it in Hogwarts, a history." Ron closed his mouth. Then opened it again. "Hogwarts, a history. Yes. You read a book about a place before you'd even been to the place. Obviously." Harry almost smiled. He filed it away, the almost smile, as evidence that normal things could still happen. That not everything had to be enormous and weighted and significant. He could be almost amused by a girl who read school histories for fun. Then the sorting hat began its song, and the almost smile faded. He stood and listened to the hat describe the 4 houses, brave, wise, loyal, ambitious, and felt the old familiar arithmetic begin in his chest. The one that asked, quietly, "Which of those things are you, actually?" Not which did he want to be. Which was he, underneath everything the Dursleys had spent 10 years telling him he was? Worthless. That had been Vernon's word, usually delivered from behind a newspaper or a door being shut in his face. Freak. That had been Dudley's, enthusiastically adopted and deployed. Burden. That one Petunia had never said aloud but had communicated with extraordinary efficiency through every meal portioned, and every birthday ignored, and every space in that house that had been carefully constructed to exclude him. Harry pressed the thoughts down. He was good at that. He'd had a decade of practice. The hat finished its song and the hall applauded and Professor McGonagall unrolled her scroll. "Abbot Hannah!" A pink-cheeked girl stumbled forward and sat on the stool. The hat dropped over her eyes and then, after a moment, Hufflepuff! Harry watched student after student walk up to that battered old hat and sit and wait and receive their verdict. He watched Hermione Granger bounce slightly on her toes before being called, watched her nearly run to the stool, watched the hat barely touch her head before roaring, "Gryffindor!" He watched Neville Longbottom, a round-faced boy who'd lost his toad on the train, shuffle forward with his eyes fixed on the floor and his hands bunched in his robes. Watched Neville sit. Watched the hat sit on him for a long, quiet moment, longer than most, and then place him in Gryffindor, and watched Neville's whole face change shape when he heard it. Harry recognized that expression. "I thought it was going to say no." "Potter, Harry." The whisper that moved through the hall was audible from where he was standing. Heads turned at both ends of the room, at the high table, in the crowd. He heard his own name repeated in fragments. Did she say Potter? Harry Potter? The Harry Potter? And he walked forward through the noise of it the same way he learned to walk through everything. Head slightly down. shoulders already prepared for the blow that was probably coming. He sat on the stool. McGonagall lowered the hat onto his head, and it dropped down over his eyes and everything went dark. Then the hat spoke, and it did not speak the way he'd expected. "Oh," it said. "Oh my." It wasn't the tone of someone surprised by a pleasant discovery. It was the tone of someone who had opened a door expecting a room and found instead an ocean. "How long?" the hat murmured in that voice that seemed to come from somewhere behind his own thoughts. "Have you been carrying this?" Harry didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer. He was aware of the hall around him, the breathing shape of it, 500 people watching a boy on a stool, and he thought, very deliberately, Gryffindor. "Just say Gryffindor." Hagrid said Gryffindor. "I can see where you want to go," the hat said. "And I can see you've earned the right to want it. Courage, yes, more than you know, more than you've been allowed to know. Intelligence. Loyalty tested to the point of breaking and never broken. You could go anywhere in this school, Harry Potter. Just pick one. But first," said the hat, and its voice changed. Went very quiet. Very careful. Like someone picking up something fragile and unexpectedly heavy. "First, I think I need you to understand what I'm touching right now." "Don't," Harry thought, and the word arrived in his chest as a physical sensation, a tightening, a clenching, the instinct of someone who has learned that being seen is always the prelude to something bad. "Don't look at that. Don't touch that. That's not for Harry. Leave it alone. Harry, this is. Leave it alone." He didn't know, afterward, exactly what happened. He knew what it felt like, a dam he hadn't known he'd built, constructed brick by brick over 10 years of a cupboard and silence and hunger, and the specific education of being told every day in every possible way that you were less than the space you occupied. That dam cracked. Not at one point. Everywhere simultaneously. The magic that came out of him was not a spell. It had no color, and no direction, and no specific intention. It was simply released. 10 years of compressed, suppressed, denied magical energy erupting outward from a boy on a stool in the middle of the Hogwarts Great Hall. The candles blew out. Every single one, simultaneously, snuffed in the same instant. Then they blazed back, brighter, twice their natural size, burning white gold instead of amber. The bewitched ceiling cracked open from cloudy gray to a night sky full of stars so vivid and close they seemed reachable. The 4 long tables shuddered once, hard enough to rattle dishes and slosh goblets. And then Harry collapsed. He went sideways off the stool in a boneless, silent way that was somehow more alarming than if he'd fallen with noise. The hat tumbled from his head. McGonagall was moving before he hit the floor, but she didn't reach him in time. He crumpled to the stone and lay still. For a single, terrible second, the hall was completely silent. Then the Sorting Hat, lying on the stone 2 feet from Harry's head, slightly crumpled, opened its brim. And spoke. Not in a murmur this time. Not in a private voice meant for one boy's ears. Loud. Clear. Like a bell struck at the center of a vast space, the sound rolling to every corner, climbing the stone walls, reaching the enchanted ceiling, finding every ear in that hall simultaneously. "Petunia Dursley." The hat's voice was nothing like it had been during the song. During the song it had been theatrical, performative, an old tradition doing what old traditions do. This was different. This was raw testimony. This was a reckoning. 10 years. 10 years of deliberate starvation. Meals withheld as punishment for existing. A child locked in a cupboard under the stairs for his bedroom. Told he was nothing. Told his parents died in a car crash because she could not bear to say the word magic. A woman who knew what this child was, who knew what he had survived, and chose fear and resentment over mercy every single day for a decade. No one in the hall made a sound. Professor McGonagall had stopped moving. She was standing 3 feet from Harry's unconscious body, and she was not moving, and her face was the color of old chalk. "Vernon Dursley." Dumbledore had risen from his chair at the center of the high table. Slowly. His face unreadable. A man who called this child a freak at breakfast as casually as he ordered bacon. Who locked him in a cupboard. Who took his school letters and doubled his chores and once, held him by the collar off the ground because the boy had the audacity to ask a question he couldn't answer. Who understood, in the clear and calculating part of himself that he kept well hidden, that breaking this child early would mean no one would ever believe anything he said later. In the Gryffindor section, someone had started crying. Harry would learn later it was Parvati Patil, who had never met him in her life, who would describe it afterward as being hit by something she couldn't name, the feeling of hearing a truth stated so plainly it bypassed every emotional defense you thought you had. Dudley Dursley. The Hat's voice changed again, not softer, exactly, but different in texture. More tired. The way a voice gets when it's reading something that goes on and on and on. 11 years old and already thoroughly educated in cruelty. Taught by example. Who made a game of hunting this child with his friends. Who broke the things Harry cared about because caring about anything was a vulnerability to be exploited. Who ate until he was sick in front of a boy who was hungry. Who doesn't understand, yet, what it means that none of this was invented. He learned it. He was made. This is not exoneration. It is context. At the high table, Professor Quirrell had gone very still. Professor Snape's face had undergone a series of rapid changes that settled, finally, into something that wasn't quite any expression Harry would have recognized, had he been conscious to see it. And the Wizarding World. The Hat paused. The Wizarding World, which made this child famous at 15 months old, and then left him on a doorstep in November with a letter. Which celebrated in the streets, and then went back to their lives and told themselves he was safe, he was fine, he was taken care of. Which built shrines to his name and named days after his survival and did not once, not in 10 years, send a single person to a perfectly findable house at number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, to ask a child if he was all right. The silence in the hall was a living thing now. It had weight. The names have been spoken. The record exists. Magic does not forget. Magic does not forgive what has been done to its own. And this child, this boy on this floor, carried every single piece of this and still came here tonight hoping to belong somewhere. Still came here hoping. The brim of the hat closed. In the ringing silence that followed, a single candle near the Ravenclaw table guttered and steadied. Then everyone started talking at once. McGonagall moved first among the staff, dropping to her knees beside Harry with her wand out, running a diagnostic charm with hands that were not entirely steady. Dumbledore descended from the high table in long strides, his purple robes sweeping the stone floor, his face arranged in something that looked like composure and functioned as a mask. "Clear the hall," he said. Quiet enough that only the staff heard him. "Minerva, hospital wing. Now. His vitals are stable," McGonagall said, which was technically an answer to a question that hadn't been asked, and which conveyed rather efficiently that she was holding herself together by professional habit alone. "Phileas, please begin escorting students to their common rooms." Dumbledore's voice remained even. It always remained even. "Tell the prefects to take their first years." Professor Flitwick hopped down from his chair and moved with impressive speed for a man of his height, clapping his hands and directing students with the practiced efficiency of someone who has managed children in crisis situations before. The Hufflepuffs moved first, shepherded by their prefects, most of them looking back over their shoulders. The Ravenclaws followed, though several were already producing notebooks with the focused intensity of people who needed to write things down in order to believe them. The Slytherins were last, and they moved the slowest, and their faces ran the full spectrum from calculated blankness to something that had started as contempt and arrived, by a short journey, at something more uncomfortable. Draco Malfoy left the hall without looking back once. His jaw was set. He didn't speak to Crabbe or Goyle as he usually would. His face, if anyone had been watching it carefully, and few people were, in that moment, looked like a boy experiencing a thought he was not yet equipped to process. In the Gryffindor section, the first years who hadn't been sorted yet were clustered together, and it was Ron Weasley who moved first. He was on his feet before any of the prefects reached them, And he was looking at the empty stool, the dropped hat, the cleared space on the floor where Harry had been. He looked at it the way you look at the place where something was, when the thing that was there mattered. Hermione, 2 people away from him, was very still. She had her hands pressed flat against the table in front of her, palms down, and she was breathing carefully, the kind of careful that means you are making a deliberate decision not to fall apart because falling apart is not useful right now. "He's going to be all right," she said. It was not entirely clear who she was saying it to. Ron looked at her. "You don't know that." "He has to be," she said, which was a different kind of statement entirely. Neville Longbottom, sitting at the far end of the Gryffindor first-year cluster, had not moved and had not spoken. He was staring at his hands folded in his lap. He was thinking about his parents. They were always there, underneath everything, the fact of his parents, and about the Sorting Hat saying "still came here hoping," and about how hope, in his experience, required a particular kind of bravery that nobody ever thought to call bravery because it didn't look like fighting anything. It just looked like showing up. He thought Harry Potter might understand that, if he ever got the chance to talk to him. The hall cleared in stages. By the time the last students were shepherding out, 4 staff members remained: Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, and Madame Pomfrey, who had arrived at a near run from the hospital wing with her bag and her particular expression of focused alarm. Pomfrey knelt beside Harry and her wand moved in quick, practiced arcs. "Magical depletion," she said, half to herself and half to the room. "Significant, but not dangerous. His core is intact. He's going to need Albus, his magical reserves are extraordinary." She paused. The wand lowered slightly. "For an 11-year-old. This is not normal output." "No," Dumbledore said. "It isn't. What he released just now, Poppy." Dumbledore's voice was gentle and specific. "Hospital wing." She looked up at him and something passed between them, a conversation happening entirely above the level of words, and she nodded once and cast a levitation charm. Snape spoke for the first time. He was standing slightly apart from the others, arms folded, face still arranged in that unreadable expression. "The hat," he said. They all looked at it. The Sorting Hat was sitting on the stone floor, brim shut, looking nothing more than what it was, an old hat, battered and patched, ancient leather with a creased crown. "The hat spoke truth," Dumbledore said. "I'm aware it spoke truth." Snape's voice was flat. "The question I'm asking is whether you knew it would." The silence that followed that question was different from the one the hat had left behind. That one had been about horror. This one was about something harder and more specific. Dumbledore looked at Severus Snape for a long moment. "Let's get the boy settled," he said. "We'll talk." Snape's expression didn't change. He watched Harry's levitated body move toward the doors of the Great Hall, and for a moment, just a moment, something moved across his face that had nothing to do with contempt or calculation or the careful performance of a man who keeps everything important behind a locked door. It looked, just briefly, like guilt. He locked it away almost immediately. But it had been there. McGonagall walked beside Harry as Pomfrey guided him through the corridor, her hand not quite touching his arm, her face forward, her jaw set with the particular rigidity of someone who is furious and has chosen the wrong moment to express it, and is therefore storing it for later, where it will come out either as extraordinary competence, or a very direct conversation with a certain headmaster. She had placed him with the Dursleys. She had signed Dumbledore's letter. She had been there that night, watching from across the street in her tabby cat form, watching Petunia Dursley open the door and find the bundle on her doorstep, and she had told Dumbledore, clearly and directly, that it was a bad idea, that these people were the worst sort of muggles, that leaving the boy there was a mistake. He'd listened. He'd thanked her. He'd made his decision. She had not pushed harder. That was on her. 10 years of whatever that hat had described, and some part of that, a small part, but not nothing, was on her. Her jaw tightened further. Her heels struck the stone floor with particular precision. Harry lay still and floating in the corridor, small in the way children look when they're unconscious, the way unconsciousness strips away all the armor people learn to wear. His glasses had slipped sideways on his face, and one lens was slightly cracked from the fall. He looked young. He looked, the word she didn't want to use arrived uninvited and wouldn't leave, he looked survived. Like someone who had come through something by sheer tenacity, and hadn't had a moment to assess the damage yet. She straightened his glasses with her wand as they moved. It was the smallest thing she could do. She did it anyway. The hospital wing was quiet and warm and smelled of dittany and clean linen. Pomfrey lowered Harry onto a bed with practiced gentleness, tucked the blanket with efficient care, and began running a more thorough diagnostic. The wand-light moved in slow patterns above him, occasionally producing soft tones of different pitches, and Pomfrey's expression as she read the results shifted through several registers before settling on something professionally controlled. "He's malnourished," she said quietly, when it was just her and McGonagall. The diagnostic completed and she stood. "Not acutely. He's not in any immediate danger from it, but chronic. Long-term. Sustained." She paused. "The kind that happens when a child is not fed adequately over years." McGonagall sat down in the chair beside the bed without being aware of deciding to sit. "Years," she repeated. "The magical depletion will resolve with sleep. The rest." Pomfrey stopped. Started again. "The magical signatures on him are fascinating and terrible, Minerva. The emotions stored in his accidental magic, they read like pressure that's been building for a decade with no outlet. What happened tonight was..." She searched for the word. "Inevitable. His magic was never going to stay quiet indefinitely. It was too large for the box they'd put it in." McGonagall looked at the boy in the bed. His breathing was even. His face, relaxed in sleep, had lost the faint watchfulness she noticed when he'd first walked into the hall, a low-level alertness she'd taken for nerves and was now reinterpreting as something trained. Something learned. "Which house?" she asked. Pomfrey raised an eyebrow. "Does it matter tonight?" "It'll matter tomorrow. When he wakes up and the school has had time to..." "Gryffindor," said a dry, age-worn voice from approximately floor level. Both women looked down. The sorting hat, which Dumbledore had apparently carried up from the hall and set on the bedside table at some point in the last 5 minutes, either of them had seen him do it, opened its brim without ceremony. "I placed him before the interruption. The placement is valid." A pause. "He belongs there. He's been belonging there for 11 years and no one gave him the room." McGonagall stared at the hat for a moment. Then she looked back at Harry. "Gryffindor," she said. Not a question. An acknowledgement. "The bravest student I've sorted in 30 years," the hat said, and then its brim closed, and it said nothing else. Dumbledore came in an hour later, when the castle had gone quiet and the hospital wing was lit only by the low warm glow of spelled lamps. He moved with less of his usual deliberate grace, the faint hesitation of a man who has been sitting with something uncomfortable and brought it with him into the room. He stood at the foot of Harry's bed for a long moment. The boy didn't stir. His breathing was deep and steady. The malnourishment charms Pomfrey had cast were doing quiet work under the blanket, and the color had begun to come back to his face in slow degrees. Dumbledore had placed him on that doorstep 10 years ago. He had stood in the dark and the cold of a November night, and he had put a sleeping child down on stone, and he had believed, he had genuinely believed, with the full weight of his very considerable intelligence, that it was the right choice. The blood protection. Petunia's blood. The ward that would keep Voldemort from being able to touch him. The magic had worked. The protection had held. Voldemort had not touched Harry Potter in 10 years. He looked at the boy's face. At the shadows under his eyes that Pomfrey had called chronic. At the wrist that extended from the blanket edge, thin in the way that accumulates over time. The magic had worked. The protection had held. He had been wrong about what that meant. "I'm sorry," he said, very quietly, to the sleeping boy. It was not a sufficient thing to say. He said it anyway. There was no response. Of course there wasn't. He stayed for a few minutes more, then turned and walked to the door. He had owls to send. The Dursleys would need to be contacted. The ministry would need to be managed. When word reached them, and word would reach them, because word always did, there would be people who wanted to make this political before it was anything else. Snape needed that conversation. McGonagall needed to know she was allowed to be angry. He stopped at the door. Looked back once. Harry Potter lay in the clean white bed and breathed in and out, steady and unaware, and his magic. Dumbledore could feel it even from here, now that he was paying attention the way he should have been paying attention for a decade. His magic was not the small, blocked, pressured thing it had been when he checked in over the years through careful and indirect means. It was open. Whatever the collapse had broken, the dam of it, the compression of 10 years, the magic that had come through the gap was not going back in. It was settling around the boy like something that had finally found room to breathe, filling the space of him, learning the shape of what it meant to be uncontained. It was enormous. It was the most extraordinary thing he'd felt since James, since Lily, since two people bright enough to make every room feel smaller, and who had made a child brighter than both. He turned back to the door. There was a great deal of work to do. Behind him, on the hospital bed, Harry Potter slept without dreaming for the first time in years. No nightmares. No tight-chested half-wakefulness waiting for footsteps outside a cupboard door. No carefully muffled breathing. Just sleep. And beneath it, vast and quiet and entirely new to itself, his magic settled in. It had been silent for a very long time. It did not intend to be silent again. In the Gryffindor common room, the first years had been herded through the portrait hole by Percy Weasley, who had done so with the slightly terrified efficiency of someone who had not prepared for this particular prefecting scenario and was compensating with volume and organization. He'd gotten everyone seated and then stood in the middle of the room looking at the collected faces of 11-year-olds staring back at him and said, "Right. Well, I think the best thing is probably sleep more actions right the next chapter now." Chapter 2, the morning after Harry woke up to sunlight. Not the thin, grudging kind that crept under the gap of a cupboard door in the early morning, the kind he'd learned to track by the movement of its stripe across the floor because it was the only way to know what time it was. This was full, broad, generous sunlight coming through tall windows and landing across a white blanket on a real bed, a bed with a proper mattress and pillows. And for approximately 4 seconds Harry lay completely still and did not know where he was. Then he remembered. All of it arrived at once, the way things do when you've been unconscious, not in pieces but as a single complete weight dropping onto your chest. The hall. The candles. The stool. The hat's voice inside his head, and the thing it had touched, and the crack, and then, nothing. Dark, and then the ceiling. He sat up. His glasses were on the small table beside the bed, cleaned and repaired, the cracked lens whole again. He put them on and the hospital wing sharpened into focus. Long room. White beds in 2 rows. Morning light and long rectangles on the stone floor. Clean and quiet in the specific way of medical places at a time when no one's currently dying. He was the only patient. He was also, he registered with faint surprise, absolutely ravenous. The kind of hungry that starts somewhere behind your sternum and radiates outward, which was a familiar sensation but sharper than usual this morning. There was a glass of water and a plate of toast on the bedside table, and he drank the water in 3 long swallows before he'd consciously decided to, then sat with the glass in his hand and thought about what had happened. The hat had spoken. He remembered the voice, that clear, carrying bell tone, nothing like the murmur it had used inside his head. He remembered the way it had said Petunia Dursley like the opening of a legal document. He didn't remember much after that because he'd already been falling, already been somewhere below conscious, but he knew, with the particular certainty of someone who understands instinctively what their own magic feels like, that it had kept going after he'd gone down. What had it said? He ate the toast and considered that question and felt, underneath the considering, something he couldn't immediately name. It took him a moment to identify it. He had to turn it over a few times. It was not shame. He'd expected shame. He'd been trained to expect shame at the revelation of anything true about the Dursleys, trained to understand that what happened at Privet Drive was a private embarrassment that reflected poorly on him specifically, that normal people didn't have these problems because normal people weren't freaks who drove their families to. He stopped that thought. Set it down. Looked at it from a slight distance. No. It wasn't shame. It was something that felt, tentatively and with significant uncertainty, like relief. Something had been said. Out loud. To a room full of people. The thing that had lived at the center of every carefully maintained silence for 10 years had been said, and the sky had not fallen. Well, the candles had blown out, and apparently he'd collapsed, but the sky as such remained, and now it was morning and he was sitting in a hospital wing eating toast, and he was still here. Still intact. The world had not ended because someone knew. He was still thinking about this when the doors opened and Madame Pomfrey came in carrying a tray with considerably more food on it than the toast, which turned out to be merely the opening act. "Good, you're awake," she said, setting the tray down with professional efficiency. "Eat all of that. No arguments." "I wasn't going to argue," Harry said. She gave him a look that suggested she'd had this conversation with less cooperative patience, and was pleasantly surprised but not ready to relax about it. "How do you feel?" He considered the honest answer. "Hungry. Not tired." "A bit." He paused, reaching for the right word. "Lighter." She ran a quick diagnostic without comment, her wand moving in those practice patterns he'd already come to associate with competence, and he watched her read the results with the focused attention of someone interpreting a language only they could see. After a moment she made a small sound. Not alarmed. More like someone confirming a suspicion they'd held overnight. "Your magical reserves have restabilized," she said. "Which is, frankly, remarkable given what you expelled last night." "What did I expel, exactly?" He asked it carefully. Not anxiously, carefully. Like someone who genuinely wants accurate information. She looked at him over her wand. Then she pulled the chair up to his bed, sat, which suggested the answer was going to take more than a moment, and said, "What do you know about accidental magic? The stuff that happens when you haven't been trained yet. Or when you're too emotional to control it." "Broadly, yes. But there's a more specific phenomenon that occurs in young witches and wizards who have experienced significant." She paused, choosing the word precisely. "Stress over a prolonged period. Magic is not simply a skill, Harry. It's a living part of you. It responds to your emotional state, grows with you, requires, like any living thing, adequate conditions to develop healthily." Another pause. When those conditions are not present, magic can become compressed. It continues to grow but it has nowhere to go, so it builds pressure. Last night, when the Sorting Hat made contact with your core, your emotional core, it released that pressure. "All at once," Harry said. "All at once." He picked up a piece of toast and ate it, and thought about that. "And the things the hat said?" Pomfrey's face did something he couldn't fully read. The hat gave voice to the contents of what was stored in that compressed magic. It essentially, the things your magic had been holding, that you hadn't been able to express, it expressed them. To the whole hall. "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her directly and asked, "Who heard it?" "Everyone," she said. "Every student who hadn't yet been escorted out. All of the staff. The headmaster." He absorbed this. Turned it over. Looked for the part of him that was supposed to find this catastrophic, that was supposed to generate the specific hot-faced horror of being exposed. Found instead that same tentative relief, larger this time. He had not chosen this. It had not been a performance, or a plea or a calculated revelation. It had simply been true, and now the truth had witnesses, and there was nothing he could do about any of it, which meant there was nothing to manage. That, actually, felt fine. "Okay," he said. Pomfrey looked at him for a moment. "That's all? What would you like me to do?" he asked. Genuinely curious, not sarcastic. "It happened. I can unhappen it." She studied him with the expression of someone recalibrating a prior assessment. "No," she said. "You can't." The doors opened again and Professor McGonagall came through at precisely the pace of someone who has been waiting outside for an appropriate amount of time and has decided that time is now. She was in full teaching robes, hat at its usual exact angle, and she was carrying a small stack of what appeared to be papers with the careful deliberateness of someone who needs something in their hands. "Mr. Potter." She stopped at the foot of his bed. Her eyes moved quickly over him, taking inventory in the way people do when they want to confirm that what they were worried about is, in fact, not as bad as the worry suggested. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," he said. Then, with the faint sense that fine was not quite accurate enough for this particular morning. "Better than last night, apparently." McGonagall's jaw did something very brief and controlled. "Yes," she said. "Well?" She glanced at Pomfrey. "Could I have a few minutes?" Pomfrey rose, smoothing her robes. "He needs to finish that tray before anything else happens," she said, which was technically addressed to McGonagall but functioned as an instruction to Harry, and then she went into her office and half-closed the door in the way that meant she was absolutely still listening. McGonagall sat in the chair Pomfrey had vacated and set her papers in her lap and looked at Harry with an expression that was the result of a very long night spent arranging things into the order in which they needed to be said. "First," she said, "you have been sorted into Gryffindor. The hat confirmed the placement was completed before the—" She stopped. "Before you fell. You are a Gryffindor. Your things have been moved to the first-year dormitory. Your housemates are aware of where you are." Harry felt something warm and specific in his chest at that. Not relief this time. Something quieter. "Thank you." She nodded once. Then, "Second, the staff have been briefed on the details of your situation. As have I." A pause that had weight in it. "I want you to know, Harry, I want to be clear with you, that what was described last night represents a profound failure of care, and I intend to ensure it is treated as such. You should not have spent 10 years in those circumstances. Full stop." He looked at her. She met it without flinching. "I appreciate that," he said. And then, because it was accurate, and she seemed like someone who valued accuracy, "I don't think you're responsible for it." Something flickered very fast across her face. "Whether I was responsible for it or not is not presently the point," she said, and her voice was even enough to communicate exactly how much she disagreed with his absolution. "The point is what happens now. The headmaster will want to speak with you this morning. I want to speak with you first so that you have the opportunity to know certain things before that conversation." He put down his toast. Gave her his full attention. "What things?" "The Ministry of Magic will need to be involved. When a minor witch or wizard is found to have been living in circumstances that would be considered abusive by any reasonable standard, wizarding law is clear that an investigation must be opened. Given the manner in which this information came to light, and given who you are—" She stopped again. There was clearly something she was navigating around. "Given your public profile, Harry, there will be political elements to this that I want you to be aware of. People who'd rather it went away quietly," he said. She blinked. Then, and this was a small thing but a real one, the corner of her mouth tightened in the way that meant she was respecting something. "Yes. There will be those who prefer a quiet resolution. I want you to know, before you speak to the headmaster, that you are under no obligation to prefer that." He held her gaze. "What do you prefer?" "I prefer," she said, with crisp and absolute clarity, "accountability." "Good," said Harry. "So do I." She looked at him for another moment. This 11-year-old who had arrived in her castle last night looking simultaneously ordinary and battered, who had survived something she didn't yet have the full picture of, who was now sitting in a hospital bed eating toast and talking about accountability with the precise calm of someone much older and much less afraid than they should have been. She had expected, if she was honest, something that required more managing. Some variation of overwhelmed or broken or in need of careful handling. She was recalibrating rapidly. The headmaster will be here at 9, she said. I'll come back at 7:30 to ensure you've had time to eat and, Professor. Harry said. Yes? Thank you. For the glasses. Someone fixed my glasses. A pause. That was nothing. I know, he said. Thank you anyway. She stood up, collected her papers, walked to the door with her heels striking the stone the way they had last night in the corridor, that specific precision. At the door she paused, her back to him. The house has been asking about you, she said. The Weasley boy and Miss Granger particularly. I told them 9 o'clock as well. A beat. Finish the tray, Mr. Potter. She left. Harry sat with the remains of his breakfast, and the morning light, and a feeling he was still in the process of identifying. It was large and tentative, and it had something to do with the professor fixing his glasses without being asked and telling him she preferred accountability, and something to do with the hat saying still came here hoping, and something to do with the fact that 3 people he'd met yesterday were asking about him. He thought it might be the very beginning of something he hadn't had enough of to recognize. He finished the tray. At 7:30, Ron Weasley came through the hospital wing doors like someone who had been told to wait in the corridor, and had done so for the maximum time he could manage before the waiting became physically untenable. Hermione was 2 steps behind him looking as though she'd spent the morning composing and discarding opening statements. And Neville came last, quiet and certain, the way he'd appeared in the armchair last night. Harry looked at the 3 of them standing at the foot of his bed. Ron said, So. How are you? He stopped. Made a face at himself. Right, that's stupid. You've just spent the night in a hospital wing. Obviously I'm fine, Harry said. Better than last night. Right. Good. Ron dropped into the chair like he'd been released from a string. Good, because right. Hermione sat on the edge of the next bed, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at Harry with an expression that was made of about 6 different things happening at once. We didn't know if you'd want. We thought you might prefer not to have. She stopped. Started differently. We wanted to come. I'm glad you did, Harry said, which was simple and true and which clearly surprised all 3 of them slightly, as though they'd prepared for something more complicated. Neville sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed without ceremony and said, Everyone's talking about it. I assumed they would be, Harry said. The older students are all. Neville paused, clearly editing. Some of them are really upset. Like upset for you. Some of them are just, I don't know. Acting like it's a story. Some of them are going to want to stare at you, Ron said bluntly, which was the most useful thing anyone had said so far. He caught Hermione's look and shrugged. What? He should know that. Better to be ready for it. He's right, Harry said. I'd rather know. Draco Malfoy, Hermione said carefully, was telling people this morning that it was some kind of. She searched for the right phrasing. Performance, Neville said quietly. He was saying you did it on purpose. A silence. Harry looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then back down. I was unconscious, he said. Not exactly prime performance conditions. Yes, well, we know that, Ron said, with a heat that had arrived quickly, which Harry noted as something genuine underneath the bluntness. He's just, Malfoy says things. What do people actually think? Harry asked, looking at the 3 of them. Not performing carelessness, actually curious. What do you think? A different silence. The kind that has texture. Hermione said, first and without hesitation. I think the hat spoke the truth because that's what it does. And I think whatever happened to you was real and documented by magic that has no reason to lie, and anyone who suggests otherwise is either ignorant or self-interested. Ron said, I think that, my mum would. He stopped. His ears went red. When the hat was saying all that. About the cupboard. I thought about my room at home and I felt. He stopped again. Something moved across his face. It wasn't fair. he said, which was simpler than what he'd been reaching for but was also, precisely, the thing. Neville said nothing for a moment. Then, looking at his hands, my gran always said that being famous doesn't mean people actually know you. I think most people in this school know the name Harry Potter, and they don't know anything else. Last night they found out something real. He looked up. That seems like it matters. Harry looked at the three of them. The girl who'd come prepared for a conversation and found instead something that didn't fit her preparation, the boy who led with bluntness because it was kinder than pretense, the quiet one who understood something about carrying things that didn't show. It does matter, he said. Thank you for coming. Before anyone could respond, the hospital wing doors opened and Albus Dumbledore walked in, and the quality of the room changed the way rooms do when certain kinds of authority enter them, a slight unconscious adjustment, like the air recognizing something. He was carrying two things, a small paper bag that turned out to contain lemon drops, and the sorting hat, which sat with apparent tranquility under his arm. He looked at the group assembled around Harry's bed and his expression, that careful, layered, lived-in face, did something that was not quite a smile and not quite an apology, and was both. Good morning, he said. I see Harry has already begun the important work of making friends. Perhaps, if you three wouldn't mind waiting just outside for a few minutes, I'll only be brief. Ron, Hermione, and Neville rose and filed out with varying degrees of willingness. Ron gave Harry a look at the door that communicated, fairly efficiently, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do, which Harry appreciated. Then it was just the two of them and the hat, and the morning light, and the particular quality of a conversation that both parties know is overdue. Dumbledore set the hat on the bedside table and pulled the chair close and sat, and looked at Harry, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Dumbledore said, How much do you remember? Everything up to collapsing, Harry said. Not what the hat said afterward. The hat spoke for approximately 4 minutes after you lost consciousness. A pause. It was thorough. Professor McGonagall told me about the investigation. The Ministry. She did. Not surprised. Not displeased. Then I'll tell you what she may not have. There will be people at the Ministry who want this handled quietly and quickly. Who will use phrases like settled privately and best interests of the child and mean something rather different by both. I want to be transparent with you about that, because you are owed transparency. Harry looked at him directly. And what do you want? Dumbledore met the look. For a man of his stature, he managed a certain quality of stillness, not the stillness of someone who has nothing to say, but someone who is choosing their words with actual care rather than habitual authority. I want you safe. I want the Dursleys held accountable through whatever channels make that possible. And I want to answer questions you may have. He paused. There are things I should explain. You left me there, Harry said. Flat. Calm. Not accusing, exactly, but not soft either, just a fact being placed on the table for both of them to look at. Dumbledore absorbed it without flinching. I did. Why? And here was the moment Harry had been sitting inside since waking up, since McGonagall with the glasses, since the hat on the stone floor, since the whole long reckoning of last night. He watched Dumbledore's face as the man organized a genuine answer, not a deflection, and he was watching for a specific thing, whether the answer would be honest. Because I believed it was necessary, Dumbledore said. Your mother's sacrifice created a protective enchantment. Her blood lives in her sister. As long as you called Petunia Dursley's home your home, Voldemort, the man who killed your parents, could not touch you. The protection required remaining with blood family. It was the strongest shield I could give you. You knew about them, Harry said. Before you left me. Professor McGonagall told you. A brief, controlled moment. She warned me that they were unsuitable. But the protection was more important. I believed, Dumbledore said slowly, that the scale of what would happen if you were unprotected, if Voldemort, or his remaining followers found you, outweighed the difficulties of a Muggle home. I believed Petunia Disley's fear of magic would moderate itself when confronted with an actual child. He stopped. I was wrong about the second belief. And the first was a calculation I had no right to make on your behalf without knowing what it would cost you. Harry looked at him for a long time. The lemon drop bag sat on the table beside the hat and the repaired glasses, and outside the windows the castle grounds were green and gold with morning, and Harry was 11 years old and sitting in a hospital bed having a conversation with the most powerful wizard alive about whether the cost of his childhood had been worth it. Did it work? Harry asked. I beg your pardon? The protection. Did it actually work? Dumbledore paused. Yes. Voldemort has not been able to approach you. Then I'm not saying it was the wrong choice, Harry said. I'm saying it was a choice you made without asking me or thinking about what it would be like. And now you know what it was like. He paused. Because everyone knows what it was like. The weight of that landed precisely. Dumbledore received it. Yes, he said quietly. Now everyone knows. Good, said Harry, and he meant it. Not viciously. Not as punishment. Just good. The knowing was not nothing. The knowing had to mean something, or what was the point? Dumbledore reached into his robes and produced a small envelope. Set it on the bed. There are practical matters to address. The Ministry investigation will be handled by a witch named Mafalda Hopkirk, whom I expect to arrive within the next 2 days. She is thorough, and she genuinely cares about the welfare of magical children. I will not tell you what to say to her. A beat. I will tell you that you are permitted to say everything. Harry picked up the envelope. Inside was a formal letter on ministry parchment, stamped and official, confirming the opening of an investigation into the welfare of Harry James Potter, minor wizard. His name, printed at the top of an official document, as someone who mattered to the formal mechanisms of the world. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it down and said, Can I go to class today? Dumbledore blinked. Just slightly. That is, yes. Madame Pomfrey will need to clear you first. But yes. Good, Harry said again, and reached for the last piece of toast from the tray, which had gone cold but was still toast, and ate it with the focused efficiency of someone who has food in front of them and understands that eating it is not to be taken for granted. Dumbledore watched him. Then he stood, tucked the lemon drops back in his pocket, and picked up the sorting hat. Harry, he said at the door. Harry looked up. The magic that came out of you last night, Dumbledore said, was remarkable. I want you to know that. Not as a warning or a complication. Simply as a fact. He paused. It will need guidance. But it is yours. It was always yours. Nothing that has been done to you changes that. Harry held his gaze. I know, he said. Which was, Dumbledore thought as he walked out, exactly the right answer. Exactly the thing that should worry him and reassure him in equal measure. Outside in the corridor, Ron, Hermione, and Neville straightened up from the wall they'd been leaning against and looked expectantly as the headmaster went past. He nodded at them pleasantly. They filed back in. Well? Ron said. I'm going to class today, Harry said. He paused. What do we have first? Transfiguration, Hermione said promptly. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has strong feelings they are choosing to express through helpfulness. I can walk you through the syllabus on the way. Please don't, Ron said. I wasn't asking you, Ronald. Harry swung his legs over the side of the bed. He felt the magic in him as he moved, not the compressed, pressured thing from before, but something loose and present and oddly comfortable, like a limb he'd spent years holding tense that had finally been allowed to relax. It moved with him. Responded to the aliveness of the morning, to the prospect of class and corridors and a school he'd been waiting for without knowing he'd been waiting. Pomfrey appeared from her office, ran one more diagnostic, produced a vitamin potion that Harry drank without complaint, and declared him cleared. Back here if you feel anything unusual, she said. Not tomorrow. Today. Immediately. Yes, ma'am, Harry said. She pointed at the door. Harry Potter walked out of the hospital wing and into Hogwarts on the morning after the night the world found out who he was. Not the famous lightning bolt, not the boy who lived, not the name on the chocolate frog cards. But him, the actual him, the one who'd been hungry in a cupboard and hoped anyway. The corridor was early morning quiet, all old stone and moving staircases and the distant smell of breakfast coming up from the great hall. 2 second-year Hufflepuffs passed and both of them stopped and stared and then, collectively, seemed to realize they were staring and looked away, which Harry noted as meaning that the whole school did in fact know, but at least some of them had the self-awareness to be awkward about it. He walked without hunching. Without the slightly braced posture that 10 years of expecting something unpleasant had built into him as default. His shoulders were level, his head up, and he walked through the corridor with the quality of someone who has just figured out they're allowed to take up space. Ron fell into step on his left, Hermione on his right, Neville a half step behind. "For what it's worth," Ron said conversationally, as they turned a corner. "Fred and George told me this morning that anyone who gives you grief about last night is going to answer to the entire Weasley family, which," he made a face, "is a lot of Weasleys." "That's very kind," Harry said. "They also want to know if you can do it again," Ron added. "The magic thing. With the candles." "Ron," Hermione said. "They asked me to ask. I'm just the messenger." Harry nearly smiled. "Tell them I'll let them know." The nearly smile arrived, this time, all the way. Behind them, the castle moved and breathed, and above the main doors, the enchanted ceiling of the great hall that Harry had never got to eat under last night was cycling through a clear autumn morning blue, and somewhere in the walls the very old magic that had stood for 1,000 years felt, or did something that functioned like feeling, the particular resonance of new magic settling in. It recognized something. Settled in response. Waited to see what came next. Chapter 3. What the Hat saw. The thing about Hogwarts that nobody warned you about was the staircases. Not that they moved. Harry had been warned about that, twice, by people who clearly felt it was the most important architectural feature of the castle. The thing nobody mentioned was that they moved while you were on them, and the first time it happened Harry was halfway between the 3rd and 4th floor with Ron 2 steps behind him, and a staircase that had been pointing left quite firmly suddenly decided it preferred pointing right, and they both grabbed the banister and held on while the stone ground and shifted beneath them. "This happens every day?" Harry said. "Every single day," Ron confirmed, with the resigned tone of someone who had grown up hearing the stories but had not anticipated the physical reality. "Fred says once you're used to it you can predict them. George says Fred's lying." "Which one is right?" "George, almost certainly." They made it to Transfiguration 7 minutes before the bell, which Hermione had planned and which meant she'd arrived 3 minutes earlier than that, and had already selected seats and opened her notebook. She gave them the look of someone who had been waiting long enough to have opinions about it. 7 minutes, she said. 6.5, Ron said, sitting down. The staircase moved. The staircase always moves. That's accounted for in a sensible schedule. You scheduled for staircase moving? Obviously. Harry took the seat between them and looked around the classroom. Stone walls, high windows, morning light cutting in at angles. Desks arranged in neat rows. At the front, a cat sat on the teacher's desk with the particular quality of stillness that means something is watching you rather than the other way around. Harry looked at the cat. The cat looked at Harry. Then it was Professor McGonagall, in the seamless way that seemed like it should be shocking and was instead simply extraordinary, glasses on, robes settled, as if she'd always been a person and the cat had been someone else entirely. The class startled collectively. A Gryffindor boy in the back knocked over his inkwell. Only Harry, who had recognized something deliberate in the quality of the cat's stillness, had remained still. McGonagall surveyed the room. Her eyes moved across Harry's face briefly, checking, he understood, cataloging, and then moved on with professional efficiency. Transfiguration, she said, is the most complex and dangerous branch of magic you will study at this school. Anyone who approaches it as anything less than serious, sustained work will fail. I do not say this to be dramatic. I say it because it is true and because this term's practical components will require you to have genuinely absorbed the theory before you touch a wand. She paused. Questions about the course structure can wait for the end of the lesson. Questions about the homework I am assigning today will be addressed in the homework itself. Now, Transfiguration operates on the principle that matter is not fixed in its essential nature but in its magical. She was, Harry discovered within the first 15 minutes, an extraordinary teacher. Not warm, not in the classroom, not in front of 30 students who needed to learn something real. But precise in the way that the best kind of precise is, where every word does exactly the work it's meant to do and nothing is wasted and clarity is the goal, always the goal. He took notes. His handwriting was cramped and slightly uneven, a function of never having been given adequate space at Privet Drive to actually practice, but the notes themselves were solid. He was not, it turned out, behind. He'd read a large portion of the theory already, on the train, in those first hungry hours with his textbooks, which had been the single best afternoon of his preceding life. He was, in fact, ahead. He did not make a show of this. But he didn't hide it either. When McGonagall asked whether anyone could explain the principle of structural memory as it applied to object transfiguration, he put his hand up alongside Hermione and was called on and gave an answer that was accurate and complete, and which McGonagall received with a short nod and the addition of a clarifying point that built on what he'd said rather than replacing it. Hermione gave him a sideways look that was made of equal parts surprise and respect. He shrugged slightly. "Train," he said quietly. "Textbooks." "Me too," she whispered back, and something clicked into place between them, a recognition, not just of intelligence, but of the specific hunger that makes you read a textbook on a train before you've even arrived at the school it's for. After Transfiguration came History of Magic, which was taught by a ghost named Professor Binns who did not appear to notice or care that he had students in the room, and which Harry survived by continuing his notes from Transfiguration and occasionally checking to see if anything the ghost said was worth recording. Mostly it wasn't, but there were 2 points about the early statute of secrecy that were interesting, and he wrote them down. Ron fell asleep 20 minutes in. Hermione took notes with the relentless industry of someone who does not distinguish between interesting and uninteresting information when it is technically relevant to a class. Neville drew small careful pictures of something in the margin of his parchment that turned out, Harry noticed, to be plants. It was, Harry thought, almost normal. Almost exactly what a first day of school was supposed to feel like. Except for the way the corridor went quiet when he walked through it. Not silent, students still talked, still moved, still did all the business of a Thursday morning at school. But there was a perceptible shift when he rounded corners, a ripple of awareness, eyes that tracked to him, and then quickly away. He heard his name in fragments. He saw, twice, older students point him out to each other with the restrained urgency of people sharing something they consider important. He passed a cluster of Hufflepuff second years who stopped talking entirely as he went by and then resumed in lower voices that he didn't bother trying to catch. He didn't hunch. Didn't speed up. Walked through it. Ron, beside him, radiated a low-level irritation at every stare that was protective in a way Harry suspected Ron himself hadn't fully identified yet. Hermione looked straight ahead with the deliberate blankness of someone who has decided that attention paid to other people paying attention is rewarding that attention, and has therefore chosen to deny it the reward. Between classes, a fifth-year Gryffindor girl that Harry didn't know stopped him in the corridor, stopped him directly, stepping into his path with the kind of purpose that meant she'd been working up to this since breakfast. "I just wanted to say," she said, and her voice was doing the thing voices do when someone has rehearsed something and is now delivering it in the slightly too loud key of sincerity, "that what happened last night was awful and nobody should have had to go through that, and if anyone gives you trouble about it, thank you," Harry said. She blinked. She'd had more to say. He could tell. "Really?" he added. "Thank you?" She looked at him for a moment, recalibrating in the way people do when they've prepared for a more complicated response. "Right," she said. "Okay." And then she went, and Harry continued to class, And Ron said, "That was the third one this morning." And Harry said, "I know." And they turned another corner and Harry held the door for Neville, who said thanks in the uncomplicated way of someone who finds holding doors unremarkable and is grateful for it without making it a thing. The trouble came in potions. It had to be potions, and it had to be Professor Snape, and Harry knew it was coming approximately 40 seconds after walking through the dungeon door because the dungeons were cold and dark and had a specific quality of intention to their atmosphere, and Professor Snape was already standing at the front of the room when they arrived, which was unusual given that they were early. And he was standing in the way that meant he had been there, prepared, which meant he had thought about this before. It started. Harry took a seat beside Ron. The room filled, Gryffindors and Slytherins together, which someone had described as traditional, and which Harry was already reading as designed to generate friction. Draco Malfoy came in with Crabbe and Goyle and selected a table at a diagonal, which placed him exactly where he could look at Harry without appearing to look at Harry. Harry noted all of this the same way he noted everything, quietly, without drama, filed. Snape let the room settle into the specific silence that good teachers sometimes use and bad teachers always weaponize. This was, Harry thought, the weaponized kind. "Potions," Snape said, and his voice did something Harry had not heard from a teacher before. It moved through the space like it expected no resistance, and had never encountered any. "Unlike some branches of magic, is not a performance. It does not reward raw power or spectacular displays." A pause, precise as a scalpel. "It rewards patience, precision, and the intellectual discipline to follow instruction without improvisation." He began to move slowly between the rows, hands clasped behind his back. "It is, therefore, a subject in which fame," another pause, shorter, surgical, "is entirely without value." A few of the Slytherins looked at Harry. Malfoy's expression was bland in the specific way of someone who has practiced blandness for exactly this kind of occasion. Harry looked at his desk. "Let us see," Snape said, arriving at the front again and surveying the class with flat black eyes. "What you actually know, as opposed to what you've been told you are." He pulled a piece of chalk from his robes and turned to the board. "Potter." Harry looked up. "What?" Snape said, writing as he spoke in a hand that was smaller and more precise than you'd expect from someone of his stature. "Would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Silence. Everyone in the room oriented toward Harry like plants toward an uncomfortable light source. Harry had, in fact, read ahead in his potions textbook. He'd read all his textbooks. He knew the answer. He also knew, with the particular situational intelligence of someone who has spent a decade reading rooms for danger, exactly what was happening in this room, what Snape had intended with the question, what was being built here and why. He could be wrong. He could deliberately not know. He could give Snape the satisfaction of a visible failure. Or he could answer the question. "The draught of living death," Harry said. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. It produces a death-like sleep in the drinker." A beat. Snape's hand paused on the chalk. Just briefly. Then continued writing. "Where," he said after a moment, "would you look if I asked you to find me a bezoar?" "The stomach of a goat," Harry said. "It counteracts most poisons." Another pause. Smaller. Snape turned from the board. "What is the difference?" he said, and his voice had shifted into something that was less theatrical now and more genuinely assessing, which Harry noted as more dangerous because it was real. "Between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "There isn't one," Harry said. "They're the same plant. Also called aconite." The room was very quiet. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Harry held it. Not defiantly. He wasn't performing defiance, wasn't trying to score a point, wasn't doing any of the things that would have given Snape something to respond to with justified authority. He was simply answering questions he knew the answers to, because that was what you did when someone asked you questions, and he didn't see a good reason to pretend otherwise. "Clearly," Snape said, "someone has been reading their textbooks." He let the pause do its usual work. Fame is not entirely incompatible with literacy, it seems. I'm not famous, Harry said. I'm just a first year who read ahead. Several things happened simultaneously. Hermione, 2 seats over, went very still. Ron looked sideways at Harry with an expression that was equal parts brilliant and oh no. Neville's quill stopped moving. At the Slytherin table, Malfoy's manufactured blandness cracked slightly at the edges, not into anger, but into something that looked, briefly, like reassessment. Snape looked at Harry with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of which Harry could read completely, and which he therefore catalogued as attention and left it there. 5 points to Gryffindor, Snape said. Flatly. Without pleasure. For correct answers. And then he turned back to the board and began writing the day's lesson, and the moment passed, or moved sideways into something that wasn't quite over but was no longer active. Harry looked at his textbook and thought, Because here was the thing about Professor Snape, and Harry had figured this much out in the space of 2 minutes. He was not simple. He was not Vernon, who was simply cruel because cruelty was easy and Harry was convenient. Snape was something more complicated. There was intelligence in him that Harry could read the way you read a room, and the intelligence was doing something with Harry that had nothing to do with Harry specifically and everything to do with something else, someone else, some history that Harry was walking into without a map. He didn't like it. But he followed it rather than reacting to it, because reacting without information was how you made things worse. He would figure out Professor Snape. He would take his time about it. The rest of potions was instructional, theory only, this first session, no cauldrons yet, and Harry worked through it with the same focused attention he'd brought to Transfiguration, building the foundation of it properly because Pomfrey had said his magic was sensitive and reactive right now, and the last thing he needed in a dungeon surrounded by volatile ingredients was his magic deciding to have opinions about something. His magic had been doing things all morning, actually. Small things. A quill rolling back toward his hand when he nudged it away. A beam of sunlight in the history of magic classroom that had shifted to fall across his parchment at a better angle. The candle at his desk in Transfiguration burning steadier and brighter than the others. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required explanation. Just a constant low-level responsiveness, like his magic was relearning how to move in the world now that it had room. He noticed it and left it alone. After potions, the Gryffindors had a free period before lunch, and the 4 of them, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Neville, ended up in a corridor near the second-floor windows that had a window seat wide enough for 2 people and a decent view of the grounds. Hermione had questions. She'd had them since the morning and she'd been containing them with heroic effort, but the free period clearly represented a scheduled release. "Can I ask you something?" she said, which was her version of asking permission even when she was going to ask regardless. "Yes," said Harry. "Last night, when it happened, did you know that it was going to?" "No." "Did you feel it building?" He thought about it. Actually thought, rather than giving the easy answer. "I felt the hat was looking at something. Something I usually don't let myself think about. And when it wouldn't stop looking, I tried to." He paused. "I tried to make it stop. And I think that made it worse." "Because you were resisting," Hermione said. "And the resistance amplified the pressure on the stored energy." "Something like that. Does it feel different now? Your magic?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Like something loosened. Like I've been walking with a rock in my shoe for 10 years and now it's gone, and my gait is still adjusting." Ron was leaning against the window looking out at the grounds where 2 older students were attempting something with a broomstick that was probably against at least 2 rules. "Do you reckon you can do more now?" he asked. "Than most first years, I mean." "Ron," Hermione said. "It's a fair question. It's an incredibly personal, it's fine," Harry said. "I don't know yet. I know it feels different. Bigger. Less blocked." He looked at his hand on the window seat beside him. Thought about the quill rolling back, the candle burning steady. Things respond more quickly than they should. But I haven't tested it properly. We could. Ron said, turning from the window with the specific energy of someone who has been waiting for this suggestion to become socially acceptable. I mean not anything dangerous. Just see what happens. After lunch, Harry said. Ron brightened considerably. Neville, who had been quiet through this exchange in the way he was quiet through most exchanges, present, attentive, clearly thinking, said, "Can I ask something too?" "Go ahead." "What happens now?" "With the Dursleys." "With the investigation." Harry looked at him. Neville met it steadily. He'd asked a harder question than either Ron or Hermione, and he'd asked it directly and without the padding of social grace that most people would have wrapped around it. Harry respected that. "There's going to be a ministry investigator coming," Harry said. "Dumbledore told me. She'll interview me. Then there'll be whatever the formal process is. I don't know what happens at the end of that. Are you worried about it?" Neville asked. "No," Harry said. Which was true. "I think it'll be fine." Which was also true, in the specific sense that fine and easy were not the same word. "My Gran," Neville said carefully, "says that the Ministry's record on protecting magical children from Muggle families is, she says it's been neglected. Historically. Because the attitude has been that what Muggles don't know can't hurt the statute, and that's meant looking the other way." He paused. "I'm not saying that to worry you. I'm saying it because you should know so you can prepare." Harry looked at him with the careful attention he'd been paying to useful people all morning. "Thank you," he said. "Genuinely." Neville shrugged, a small self-contained motion that meant it was the right thing to say, so I said it. They went to lunch. The Great Hall, this time, with the full complement of students and the enchanted ceiling doing a perfect clear blue autumn sky and the 4 long tables full and loud with the business of people who have spent a morning doing difficult things and are now compensating with food and noise. Harry walked in and the noise dropped about 20% in his immediate vicinity, spread outward like a ripple, and then the hall made the collective social decision that conspicuously not looking was more dignified than staring, and the volume came back up and everyone very deliberately went about their lunch. Harry sat down and piled his plate with more food than he had any memory of ever being allowed and ate with the focused appreciation of someone to whom this was extraordinary, and who was not yet practiced enough at having it that it felt ordinary. Ron ate with industrial efficiency and cheerful disregard for the watching hall. Hermione had a book open beside her plate, which she was definitely reading, until she noticed Harry noticing, and closed it, and then spent the next 5 minutes not opening it again, and visibly finding this a challenge. Harry smiled at her. "You can read." "It's rude," she said. "It's fine," he said. "I don't mind." She opened it again with the contained relief of someone given permission. The afternoon brought them to flying lessons, which were scheduled for Gryffindors and Slytherins on Thursday, out on the lawn below the castle, brooms laid in a row on the grass and Madame Hooch standing at the top with her yellow hawk eyes scanning the assembled students. Harry stood in line with a broom beside him and felt the magic in him notice the broom the way you notice something familiar, a reaching, a recognition. Like the broom had said something and the magic had heard it. He wasn't surprised when it jumped into his hand on the first command. He was a little surprised by how far off the ground it lifted, not the few inches most first years were managing in those initial tentative hovering attempts, but a clean 3 feet, the broom absolutely steady, absolutely certain. Madame Hooch looked at him. He looked at the broom. "Well," she said in a voice that was making very careful efforts not to sound as interested as she was. "Good." Draco Malfoy, 2 spots down the line, had achieved perhaps 14 inches and was trying to look as though this was exactly the height he'd intended. His broom was twitching slightly, picking up on the slight tremor in the hand of a boy who was absolutely not going to admit that some things did not come naturally to him simply because he had been told his whole life that they did. Harry looked at Draco Malfoy's broom for a moment. Looked at Draco Malfoy's face. The manufactured composure, the particular tight set of the jaw under it. He'd seen that face before. In mirrors. The look of someone working very hard to look like they weren't working at all. He found, to mild surprise, that he did not dislike Draco Malfoy. He didn't trust him. He didn't think they were going to be friends. But the simple fact of recognizing something underneath the performance changed the quality of his assessment. Draco Malfoy was not Vernon. Draco Malfoy was a boy who had been given a particular education about himself and the world and was still in the process of becoming. Whether what he became would be worth knowing, that was the thing still to be determined. Right, Madame Hooch said. Up. And then we're going to work on controlled hovering. Harry hovered at 3 feet and practiced controlled hovering and did not show off and did not push the height further, because there was a difference between not hiding what you were and performing what you were, and he'd never been interested in performance. Though he did, toward the end of the lesson, when Neville's broom decided to misbehave badly and Neville went up fast and uncontrolled, Harry moved instinctively. His own broom tracked left without being asked, following the arc of what was about to happen, and when Neville came off and fell, Harry was already there, already alongside, and the fall that would have hurt Neville badly was instead a fall of 2 feet instead of 15. He didn't catch Neville, exactly. He was just there. Neville landed on the grass. Looked up at Harry. Are you okay? Harry asked. My wrist. Neville was holding it. Not broken, already clear from the angle, but Jared. I'm okay. Did you actually just… I wasn't thinking about it, Harry said honestly. And that was true. He hadn't thought. The magic had gone, and his broom had moved, and the distance had closed. His magic had looked at Neville falling and decided that wasn't acceptable, and had done something about it before Harry had finished having the thought. Madame Hooch was there in seconds, assessing Neville's wrist, declaring it a mild sprain, sending him to the hospital wing with a slightly pink-faced expression that communicated she had seen what Harry had done and was still processing where it sat on the spectrum of rule-following and rule-bending. Instinct, she said to Harry quietly, when Neville had gone. Yes, he said. Instinct, she said again, is going to make you a spectacular Quidditch player. He looked at her with the directness that seemed to startle adults slightly until they got used to it. Can first-years play? No, she said. They cannot. They looked at each other. Theoretically, he said. The rule exists, she said, to prevent very small people from being knocked off very fast brooms by very large bludgers. That seems sensible. It does, doesn't it? She looked out at the remaining students landing their brooms in various states of competence. I'm going to mention to Professor McGonagall, she said carefully, that I have a student with exceptional instinctive ability. As a matter of professional course. I'm not going to suggest anything specific. Of course not, Harry said. Good, she said. Back in line, Potter. He went back in line. Ron, who was close enough to have heard, was looking at him with the expression of someone experiencing a vivid, specific fantasy about Quidditch that had just been made significantly more interesting. You do realize, Ron said in a low voice, that if you end up on the team, she said, first-years can't play. Theoretically, Ron said, with enormous pleasure. After dinner, back in the Gryffindor common room, the fire going and the noise of 30 Gryffindors doing the first night's homework, Harry sat at one of the tables with his books open and worked through his Transfiguration essay with the steady attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what they're learning. The magic, beside him, around him, of him, moved in that new loose easy way. Steady. Present. Unhidden. Hermione sat across from him and they worked in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging books or sharing a passage, and Ron sat at the end of the table pretending to do his astronomy homework, while actually reading a Quidditch magazine at about 30 degrees behind the textbook, which fooled no one. Neville came down from the dormitory with his wrists wrapped and his herbology book and a determined expression, and sat beside Ron without being invited and opened his book, and Ron moved the Quidditch magazine without being asked. The fire crackled. The common room noise was warm and constant. Outside the castle windows, the first stars were coming up over the grounds in a sky that had gone from blue to the particular deep purple of early evening, and somewhere far away a barn owl was crossing between towers, carrying correspondence to somewhere it needed to be. Harry looked up from his essay and looked at the three people at his table: the girl whose intensity was the same stuff as his own hunger, the boy whose easy loyalty was a more genuine thing than it yet knew itself to be, the quiet one who understood something about hope and cost, and showing up anyway. His magic moved. Settled. Warm. He went back to his essay. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Snape walked back to his office after the day's last class and stood for a moment inside the door before he cast the lock. He sat at his desk. Stared at the surface of it. The boy had answered all three questions. Correctly, completely, without hesitation and without the performance of knowing, without the showing off, without the please notice me that Snape had spent 16 years associating with the name Potter. He'd answered like someone who had simply read the book because they wanted to know what was in it. Snape reached for a quill and pulled a blank piece of parchment toward him. Set the quill down without using it. Picked it up again. The hat's voice from last night had not left the interior of his head in the way that other unpleasant things usually did, through the mental disciplines he'd spent 30 years building, the occlumency that kept the worst things in their compartments. It was still there. Still playing. A man who called this child a freak at breakfast as casually as he ordered bacon. He knew what calling someone a freak felt like. Both directions. He also knew what it felt like to look at a face and see a different face behind it, and to punish the first face for the crimes of the second, and to call that justice when it was really something much smaller and much uglier than justice. He had known it for several years, actually. He had simply chosen, each September, to go on doing it anyway. He put the quill down. He did not make any decisions tonight. He was not built for the kind of people who made clean overnight decisions and stuck to them, that required a certain architecture he'd never possessed. But he sat with something he hadn't sat with before, and that was something. In the morning he would teach the boy potions. He would be exacting and demanding and fair, because that was what the subject required, and because exacting and demanding and fair was not the same as the thing he had been doing before. It was, he thought, the least he could do. Which was accurate. It was also a start. Chapter 4. The names that were spoken. The ministry official arrived on a Tuesday. Harry knew she was coming before anyone told him, not through magic, not through any particular sixth sense, but because Professor McGonagall came to find him at breakfast with the specific energy of someone who has been awake since 5 in the morning managing logistics and is now delivering information that she has already formed strong opinions about. She sat down across from him at the Gryffindor table, which several nearby students registered with wide eyes because McGonagall sitting at a student table before 8 in the morning was apparently a significant meteorological event, and said, "The investigator arrives at 10. I'll come get you from Charms." "What's she like?" Harry asked. "Thorough," McGonagall said, which was the same word Dumbledore had used, and which Harry was beginning to understand meant good at her job in ways that will either help or complicate this depending on what she decides to prioritize. "Thorough like she'll ask hard questions, or thorough like she'll actually do something?" McGonagall looked at him over the rim of her tartan hat. "Both, ideally." "Has she read the hats? She has a full transcript," McGonagall said. "The hat's testimony is legally admissible as witness evidence under the Magical Beings Classification Act of 1847. The hat has testified in ministry proceedings twice before, and both times its evidence was accepted without challenge." A pause. "She knows what she's walking into." Harry nodded and went back to his eggs. Hermione, beside him, had been very deliberately not listening with the focused attention of someone who was absolutely listening, and had already formed 17 questions she was restraining herself from asking. "You'll be fine," she said, when McGonagall left. "I know," Harry said. She looked at him sideways. "You could prepare. I mean, if you wanted to think about what you want to say. I'm just going to tell the truth," Harry said. "It's already out there. I'm not adding anything complicated." She thought about that. "That's actually the smartest approach." "I know," he said again, and ate his toast. Ron arrived from the end of the table where he'd been talking to Fred and George, dropped back into his seat, and said, without preamble, "Fred says the whole ministry is buzzing about it. His dad works there, Muggle Artifacts office, and apparently there are people arguing about jurisdiction and whether magical child welfare law even covers." He stopped when Hermione gave him a look. "What?" "He should know." "He does know," Harry said. "Go on." "Whether it covers Muggle-raised magical children who live with Muggle families. Apparently there's some technical argument that since the Dursleys are Muggles, Muggle social services should be. That's deliberately obstructive." Hermione said immediately. "The child in question is magical. The harm was done to a magical child. Magical jurisdiction clearly applies." "I agree," Ron said. "I'm just telling you what Fred said." "Who's making that argument?" Harry asked. "Someone from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, apparently. Some senior official." Ron's ears went slightly red. "Fred said the name, but I can't remember it." Harry filed this. Not with alarm, with attention. There were people who wanted this to go away. Dumbledore had told him. McGonagall had told him. He'd already known, from a lifetime of practice reading the gap between what people said and what they meant. Knowing the argument they were going to use was useful. He'd think about it. Charms was on the second floor in a classroom that smelled faintly of something sparkling, which turned out to be a residual effect of fifth-year work the day before. Professor Flitwick was a tiny man with the specific quality of a person who has long since stopped being sensitive about their height because their competence has rendered the height entirely irrelevant, and he taught with a buoyancy that was not the bouncing energy of someone performing enthusiasm but the genuine pleasure of someone who loved what they did and had found that teaching it was an extension of the love. They were learning the levitation charm. Wingardium Leviosa. Flitwick demonstrated with a feather on his desk, the feather rising in a smooth, clean arc, and then had them practice the wand movement first without the incantation. Harry's first attempt produced a feather that rose about a foot, which was the standard range for a first try. His second attempt sent it to the ceiling. Flitwick made a small sound. "Sorry," Harry said. "Don't be," Flitwick said, with a warmth that was completely genuine. "Bring it back down. Same motion, same energy, half the intention." Harry looked at the feather floating against the stone ceiling and thought half the intention, and the feather descended in an even arc and landed back on the desk. "Splendid," said Flitwick. 10 points to Gryffindor. "Now, Mr. Potter, perhaps you could try it with the incantation and aim for approximately here." He indicated a height of about 2 feet. "And hold it there." Harry did. The feather sat at 2 feet as though it had decided that was the best place to be and had no intention of moving. The magic doing it felt like. He was developing a vocabulary for what his magic felt like now, in these first days after the release, and this felt like a hand held out flat with something resting on the palm. Effortless. Supported. He looked around the classroom. Ron's feather was rising. Hermione's was spinning slightly, too much wrist. Neville's was not yet off the desk, but he was focused in a way that suggested it was imminent. From 2 tables away, Seamus Finnegan's feather caught fire. "That," Flitwick said, calmly redirecting, "is also a result, though not the intended one." McGonagall appeared at the classroom door at precisely 5 minutes past 10. Harry saw her face before she knocked, the particular expression of a woman with a schedule who has been intercepted by unscheduled things twice already today and is not going to let a third thing delay what she came for. She knocked once. Flitwick looked up. "Mr. Potter," she said from the doorway. "Whenever you're ready." Harry set his feather down. Gathered his bag with the movement of someone who has been expecting this, and therefore has nothing to arrange. He followed McGonagall into the corridor, and she fell into step beside him, walking at a pace that was purposeful without being rushed. "Her name is Mafalda Hopkirk," McGonagall said as they went. "She's been with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 12 years. She was the investigator on the Parkin case in 1988, a wizarding child removed from an abusive household, and the Stanton case 2 years before that. She knows what she's doing." Who's going to be in the room? Harry asked. Myself. The headmaster. Her. McGonagall paused. And whoever she's brought with her. She mentioned a colleague. I don't know who. Did she say anything when you spoke to her? About her read on the situation? McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She said, and I am quoting, that the hat's testimony represented the most clearly documented case of sustained magical child abuse she had encountered in 12 years of practice. And that she intended to treat it accordingly. Good, Harry said. They walked through 2 more corridors and up a staircase that didn't move for once, as if the castle understood this wasn't a morning for additional complications, and then through a door Harry hadn't noticed before that opened off a corridor near the gargoyle. Not the headmaster's office, a smaller room, a conference room of sorts, with a round table and chairs and a window and a fire going low and a grate at one end. Dumbledore was already there, standing near the window in his least theatrical robes, deep blue, simple, the kind that said this is a formal occasion and I am participating in its formality without the elaborate embroidery of his usual teaching dress. He looked at Harry when he came in and gave one of his small nods, the kind that communicated several things simultaneously without spelling any of them out. At the table sat 2 people Harry hadn't met. The first was a woman in her mid-40s with sharp, clever eyes and a face that had the particular quality of someone who spent most of their professional life deciding whether they were being told the truth. She had a neat stack of parchment in front of her and a quick quotes quill that was not running yet, which Harry noticed as a deliberate signal that nothing was being officially recorded until she decided it was. That was, he thought, a thoughtful gesture. This was Mafalda Hopkirk. The second person was a man Harry had not expected, young, maybe late 20s, with dark skin and watchful eyes and a face that was doing careful official neutrality in the way of someone trained to it. He had the look of a Hogwarts graduate, the particular straightness of someone who went through this castle and came out shaped by it, and he was wearing ministry robes, but they didn't fit him quite the way career ministry robes usually did, which Harry filed as someone who perhaps hadn't always planned on this job. Harry, Dumbledore said. This is Investigator Hopkirk, and her colleague, Aura Shacklebolt. The young man with the watchful eyes nodded. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Harry would learn, was 3 years out of Aura training and had been assigned to this case specifically because someone at the Ministry who genuinely cared about getting it right had decided it needed someone who was not going to be politically managed. He had the quality of absolute steadiness that some people are simply born with, and which no amount of training can produce if it isn't already there. Harry sat down across from Hopkirk. McGonagall sat to his left. Thank you for coming, Hopkirk said, and her voice was direct without being cold. I want to start by explaining exactly what this process is, so there are no surprises. This is a preliminary welfare interview. It's not a trial, not a deposition, and nothing you say here is going to be used against you in any form. My job is to understand what your situation was at Privet Drive and to determine what formal action is appropriate. I have the hat's testimony. But the hat speaks to stored magical memory. It doesn't tell me about the specific experience of the person holding those memories. That's what I need from you. Harry looked at her. She was telling the truth. He could tell, not magically, not through any supernatural gift. Through the simpler and more reliable mechanism of having spent 10 years learning to read exactly which people were managing him and which were engaging with him. She was engaging. Okay, he said. Can you tell me, in your own words, at whatever pace you like, what your daily life looked like at number 4, Privet Drive? And Harry told her. He'd never told anyone before. He'd gone close a few times, the approaching edge of telling a teacher at his primary school who'd looked at him a certain way, and had each time found the specific familiar reasons not to, because the Dursleys would find out, because nobody would believe him, because what would happen afterward would be worse than what was happening now. All the careful architecture that keeps abused children silent. But this was different. The hat had already spoken. The worst of the telling was done. What he was adding now was just specificity. Detail. The architecture made solid and real. He told her about the cupboard. Not with emotion, not with performance, just with the accuracy of someone describing floor dimensions. 4 feet by 3 feet. A hook on the inside of the door that had been his, used for his second-hand coat in winter. The smell of it, dust and old shoes. The stripe of light under the door. He told her about the food. The deliberate portioning that was never quite enough, that had started before he was old enough to understand it as deliberate. The way he'd known, by age 6, not to ask for seconds. The way certain smells, roasting meat, warm sugar, had for years meant Dursley dinners he stood and served and was not offered. He told her about the chores. That one he kept brief because it was long and because Hopkirk was writing with quick, efficient shorthand strokes that meant she had enough, she was tracking. He told her about the primary school years, about Dudley and his friends, about the specific geography of avoiding people who have been told, consistently, that hurting you is amusing and consequence-free. He did not cry. Not because he was holding it together, but because this was not, for him, primarily a sad thing in this moment. It was an accurate accounting. It was a record being made in the right place by the right person, and the emotion connected to it was less grief than something fiercer, something that had no interest in tears because tears were private, and what he wanted was for this to be the most witnessed, documented, officially consequential account of what had happened that it was possible for it to be. Hopkirk wrote and listened and asked clarifying questions when she needed them, and did not once make the specific terrible face that adults sometimes make when a child tells them something bad, the face that is pity wearing the costume of concern and is actually about the adult's discomfort rather than the child's experience. She simply took it in, seriously, as evidence. Shacklebolt was very still throughout. He was watching Harry's face and hands with the focused attention of someone trained to read testimony. And his expression didn't change, but once, when Harry described Vernon holding him off the ground by his collar, something moved across Shacklebolt's face that was very fast and very controlled, and which Harry caught because he caught everything, and which he read as genuine anger. Not performed, not procedural. Real. Harry found he appreciated that. He finished. There was a moment of quiet in which Hopkirk reviewed her notes, and Shacklebolt looked at the table and Dumbledore, by the window, was still. McGonagall said nothing. She had been silent throughout, which had been the right call, but Harry could feel the contained precision of her response to everything he'd said in the quality of that silence, banked and controlled, and waiting. "Thank you," Hopkirk said. She set down her quill. "Harry, I need to ask you one more question and I want you to take your time with it. Is there anything else? Anything that happened at Privet Drive that the Hat's testimony didn't cover? Anything that felt important that isn't yet part of the record?" Harry thought about it. Genuinely considered. "The letters," he said. "The Hogwarts letters. Vernon kept them. He boarded up the letter slot, and then they started coming in other ways and he moved us from house to house trying to stop them coming. There were hundreds of them in the end. He knew they were important. He kept them deliberately." Hopkirk wrote. "And you never read any of them until Hagrid brought one. Verbally, and then he gave me the physical letter." Harry paused. "I'd like to see the others someday. The ones Vernon kept. If the investigation would have access to those. That would be within the scope of a formal search of the property, yes," Hopkirk said. She paused. "I'll make sure we recover them." Harry nodded. Then the door opened. It opened without knocking, which was enough on its own to establish that the person opening it had made a calculation about whether knocking was required and decided it wasn't. The man who came in was 50s, broad, ministry robes in the more expensive cut that meant senior, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now settled into the comfortable authority of someone who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around his arrival. Harry didn't know him. He looked at the faces of the people who did. Dumbledore's expression moved imperceptibly into something watchful. McGonagall's jaw tightened. Hopkirk went very still with the specific stillness of someone managing a reaction. "Cornelius," Dumbledore said. Pleasantly. "As you would say the name of someone you expected to see eventually, and have been prepared for. Minister Cornelius Fudge." Harry identified the title from Dumbledore's tone and the ministry robes, and the quality of the reaction in the room. Fudge looked at Harry with an expression that was trying very hard to be warm and was actually a very precise calculation. "Harry, my boy, I'm not your boy," Harry said. "A beat." Fudge blinked. The warmth recalibrated. "Of course, I only meant, what brings you to Hogwarts today, Minister?" Dumbledore asked. His voice was tranquil. "Simply ensuring things are handled properly," Fudge said with a smile that was doing a great deal of work. He moved to the table, looked at the parchment, looked at Harry, looked at Hopkirk. "Mafalda, I'm sure you've been thorough." "Always," Hopkirk said. "Good. Good." He sat down at the table, uninvited, at the chair beside Hopkirk, which positioned him directly across the table from Harry. "Now, Harry, we all want to make sure this is dealt with sensitively. The Dursley family, Harry said, "starved me and locked me in a cupboard for 10 years. Fudge's mouth, which had been opening around its next sentence, paused. "I'm not interested in sensitive," Harry said. He wasn't aggressive about it. He wasn't angry, or rather, the anger was there, but it was behind something colder and more useful. He was just clear. The kind of clear that has decided it has no more energy for the management of other people's comfort. "I'm interested in accurate." Naturally, Fudge said, recovering. He arranged his face into something fatherly. "But we have to think about what's best for the Wizarding Worlds." "The Wizarding Worlds what?" Harry asked. Another pause. "The Wizarding World," Harry said, "left me on a doorstep in November when I was 15 months old, and then celebrated for 10 years while I lived in a cupboard. I don't think what's best for the Wizarding World's image is the most important thing in this room right now." The fire crackled quietly. Fudge looked at Dumbledore with the expression of someone who has just received evidence that the conversation is not going to be what they expected, and would like someone else to manage it. Dumbledore looked back at him with a pleasantness that gave him absolutely nothing. "Minister," Shacklebolt said, from his end of the table, in a voice that was professionally courteous and completely unyielding. "This is an active welfare investigation. Official ministry procedure doesn't permit ministerial observation of preliminary interviews. I'd be happy to brief you on the findings when the interview process is complete." Fudge looked at Shacklebolt, assessed him, made the calculation of someone who knows that pushing against procedure in front of witnesses is a different thing than pushing against it privately. "Of course," he said. "Of course. I'll let you get on." He stood, looked at Harry once more. "We'll get this sorted out properly, Harry. You have the ministry's full support." "I heard," Harry said. "Thank you." Fudge left. The door closed. McGonagall let out a very controlled breath through her nose. Hopkirk made a note on her parchment. Shacklebolt looked at Harry with an expression that was, beneath its professional neutrality, something that might have been satisfaction. "Sorry about the interruption," Hopkirk said. "Don't be," Harry said. "I assumed something like that would happen." She looked at him steadily. "You handled it well." "The truth is easy," Harry said. "It's already there. You don't have to remember what you said." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, for the first time in the interview, the corner of her mouth moved. "No," she said. "You don't." She closed her notebook and looked at Dumbledore. "I'll have a formal report prepared by the end of the week. Based on what I have, I'll be recommending formal charges against Vernon and Petunia Dursley under Sections 4 through 7 of the Magical Child Welfare Act, and I'll be requesting a joint investigation with Muggle Social Services regarding the welfare of any other children in that household." She glanced at her notes. "The Dursley child." "Dudley?" Harry said. "Yes." He thought about Dudley. Fat, loud, casually cruel Dudley, who had grown up in the same house absorbing the same lessons, who had been given everything and used it to take more. He thought about what the hat had said. He learned it, he was made, this is not exoneration, it is context, and about the fact that Dudley was, in the end, also 11 years old. He's not a good person," Harry said carefully. "But he's a kid. Whatever happens, I don't want him to be. I want him to have the chance to be different. If he wants it." Hopkirk looked at him. Made a note. Said quietly, "I'll keep that in mind." The meeting ended. Harry walked back to Charms, late, but Flitwick waved him in without comment, and conjured an extra feather for him on his desk with the air of a man who had the full picture and had decided the best thing he could offer was normalcy. Harry levitated the feather to the correct height, held it steady, and went back to work. At lunch, Ron wanted to know everything. He got the version Harry was willing to give in the middle of a dining hall, which was the shape of it without the texture. Hermione got the same. Neville, characteristically, asked one specific question. Did they listen? And when Harry said yes, Neville nodded once in the way that meant it was the only thing he needed to know. It was Hermione, that afternoon in the library while they worked on a defense against the dark arts essay, who noticed first. "Harry," she said very quietly. He looked up from his parchment. She was looking at his hand. The hand that was holding his quill. The air around it, around his whole arm actually, now that he looked, was doing something very faint. Something that wasn't quite visible and wasn't quite not visible. A shimmer. A warmth. He set the quill down and looked at his hand. Turned it over. "It's been doing that since the interview," he said. "What does it feel like?" He considered. "Like, when you've been outside in the cold, and you come in near a fire, and you can feel it warming all the way through. Except it's coming from inside." Hermione was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "I think I read something about this. In Advanced Magic, Theory and Practice. There's a chapter on emotional resonance in post-suppression magical release. When a magical person who has had their magic significantly suppressed, either deliberately or circumstantially, finally expresses it fully, the magic can enter an active recalibration phase." She looked at him. "It's learning how much space it actually has. How long does that last?" The book said weeks. Possibly months. She paused. "It also said that during this phase, the magic can respond to emotional stimuli with unusual intensity." "Unusual how?" "Proportional to the stimulus," she said carefully. "When you're calm, it's calm. But when you're not calm, what happened in the meeting with Fudge?" Harry said. She looked at him. "I wasn't there. My magic got very warm when he sat down," Harry said. "And then when he said sensitive, it got warmer." Hermione processed this. "You stayed calm, though." "I was calm," he said. Which was true. The magic was angry. I wasn't particularly interested in being angry. I wanted to be clear. She stared at him for a moment. "That might be the most extraordinary piece of emotional intelligence I've encountered from someone our age." "Stop," Ron said from behind a book he wasn't reading. "You'll make him insufferable. He already answered all of Snape's questions correctly on the first day," she said. "I think that ship has sailed." Harry picked up his quill and went back to his essay. The warmth in his hand settled. Outside the library windows the afternoon was moving toward evening, the sky going amber and long, and somewhere in the castle the staircases were rearranging themselves with the comfortable indifference of architecture that has been doing what it wants for 1,000 years and sees no reason to stop. He finished his essay. Read it back. Added 2 points that made it better. He was here. He was working. He was handled nothing. That evening, after dinner, a school owl found him in the common room with a letter from Hopkirk confirming that the formal charges had been filed and the investigation was proceeding. A second letter, shorter, arrived 20 minutes later. This one had no ministry seal. The handwriting was blocky and large, and it said, "Heard you told the minister off. Well done." K.S. Harry looked at the initials. Looked at the letter. Folded it, and put it in his bag with the methodical care of someone keeping something that might matter. Ron, reading over his shoulder with the complete lack of self-consciousness that Harry was coming to understand was simply how Ron operated in close proximity to anything interesting, said, "Who's K.S.?" Shacklebolt, Harry said. The Auror from the interview. He sent you a note? Apparently. Ron absorbed this. That's a good sign, right? That an actual Auror thinks you. It's a good sign, Harry confirmed. A log shifted in the fireplace. The common room noise continued around them. Quidditch argument in one corner, Seamus and Dean discussing something about a Muggle card game in another, the second-year girls doing charms revision on the rug near the hearth. The comfortable living noise of 30 Gryffindors doing an ordinary Tuesday evening. Harry looked at the fire. He was owed ordinary. He was going to have it. And whatever came next, ministry politics, Snape's watchful silences, Dumbledore's careful calculations, Fudge's management of appearances, none of it was going to take this from him. He reached for his Transfiguration book. He had 20 pages of reading to do before tomorrow. He started at the beginning. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Damage. Halloween arrived with the smell of pumpkin and rain. Harry woke up that morning already aware of the date in the way you become aware of dates that have been attached to something significant before you were old enough to have opinions about them. October 31st. The day his parents died. The day he hadn't died. The day that had made him whatever he was to the wizarding world, symbol, myth, name on a chocolate frog card, before he'd been old enough to form a complete sentence. He lay in the dormitory for a few minutes and let the morning be what it was. Outside the tower windows the sky was doing the gray-churning thing that meant real weather coming, not the decorative kind. Wind off the lake. Bare branch movement in the trees at the forest edge. He got up, dressed, went to breakfast. Ron was already there, halfway through a plate of eggs, reading a letter from home that had arrived with the morning owls. He handed it to Harry without comment when Harry sat down. The letter was from Mrs. Weasley. Harry had been receiving one every 2 weeks since term started, a fact that he had initially found bewildering and had since settled into something he didn't examine too directly because examining it produced a warm, unsteady feeling he wasn't entirely sure what to do with. This one was about jumper sizes, which Ron had apparently not provided accurately in his last letter home, and contained a postscript that said, "Tell Harry we're all thinking of him today, and that he's welcome at Christmas if he'd like to come." Harry read it twice. Handed it back. "She does that," Ron said. "Writes to people. Collects them." "I don't mind," Harry said. "I know. I wanted you to know it's real. She actually means it, she's not just, I know," Harry said. Which he did. He had, by this point in his life, become quite good at identifying genuine offers versus the performance of them. He ate breakfast and thought about his parents, quietly, the way you think about people you never knew but are made of anyway. Lily and James Potter. The photographs in his album. Hagrid had given him the album at the end of their first trip to Diagon Alley, assembled from pictures Hagrid had gathered from people who'd known them, and Harry had looked at it every night for the first 2 weeks of term. His mother's eyes in a face that was unmistakably not his. His father's face in a face that was unmistakably his. The way they moved in the photographs, alive in the specific impossible way of wizarding photographs, waving and laughing and looking at each other with the expression of people who do not know that they are looking at each other for a finite number of times. He didn't cry over them. He didn't think that was wrong. He never had them, so the grief for them was a strange thing, not the grief of losing but the grief of never having, which was its own shape and its own weight. He just thought about them. Let them be real, for a few minutes, over toast and pumpkin juice on the morning of the day they died. Then he went to class. The castle was doing its Halloween decorations, which meant a great many floating candles in orange and black, live bats circling the upper corridors in slow loops, and the great hall being transformed during the day, the ceiling going from rainy gray to a low dramatic purple dark, the usual house tables flanked by enormous carved pumpkins with candles inside. Peeves was in particularly high spirits, which for the student body of Hogwarts meant a particularly high probability of something unpleasant landing on your head between floors 3 and 5, and had apparently already deposited an entire cauldron of water on a group of second-year Slytherins that morning. Double herbology with the Hufflepuffs in the morning. Harry liked herbology. He liked Professor Sprout, who was small and cheerful and covered in dirt in the way of someone who considered that an entirely satisfactory state of affairs, and who taught with the practical energy of someone who understood that the best way to learn about living things was to get your hands in them. He repotted a screaming horntail seedling with focused efficiency, learned the specific restraining technique that kept its fronds from latching onto your wrist, and came away with dirt under his fingernails and the satisfied tiredness of physical work, which was different in quality from the tiredness of chores because the thing you'd done was yours. Neville was excellent at herbology. Not surprising, exactly. He'd seen the margin plants in History of Magic, but excellent in the specific way that illuminated something about him. In most classrooms, Neville had the posture of someone waiting to be told he'd done something wrong. In herbology, he just worked. Steadily and surely, without the anxious checking and rechecking, and Professor Sprout moved past his station twice and each time made a small positive noise that Neville received with the controlled pleasure of someone who has learned not to expect it and hasn't quite stopped hoping for it. Harry thought about that. About Neville and the long, slow work of learning that you were allowed to be good at things. By afternoon, the rain had arrived properly, hitting the castle windows in long gray sheets, and the corridors had that particular quality of warmth contrast that makes warm stone corridors feel like something built specifically against the weather. Harry came back from afternoon defense against the dark arts with his bag over one shoulder, and his hair doing what his hair always did in rain, which was approximately nothing it hadn't already been doing. Defense was taught by Professor Quirrell, who was... Harry had been forming an opinion about Professor Quirrell since the second week of term, and the opinion was not complimentary. Not because Quirrell was unpleasant in any specific identifiable way. He was, in fact, carefully pleasant, deferential, nervous, full of a stammering anxiety that he deployed around students and staff alike with the consistency of a man for whom nervousness was a primary mode. He wore a purple turban that he explained, when asked, was a gift from an African prince who'd helped him defeat a troublesome zombie, which was the specific quality of lie that is too elaborate to be honest. Quirrell's face, when it didn't know it was being watched, was different from Quirrell's face when it did. Harry had noticed this on approximately day 3. He hadn't said anything yet. He was watching. Filing. Building the picture with the patience of someone who understands that certainty is more useful than speed. Today Quirrell had taught them about defensive theory, the principle of barrier charms, the history of shield construction, and had done it with the distracted quality of someone whose mind was partially elsewhere. His left hand, Harry had noticed, kept moving toward the back of his own head in an absent gesture, as though checking something, and each time he caught himself doing it he stopped and re-engaged with the class with slightly too much effort. Harry had watched his own quill make notes about shield charms and thought about the back of Quirrell's turban and the smell of the classroom when you stood near him, which was something underneath the chalk and parchment smell that Harry couldn't name and couldn't stop noticing. Wrong was the best he could do. Something was wrong. He kept this to himself for now. He had no evidence. He had an instinct and a smell and the face behind the face observation. That was not nothing. But it was also not something you took to the headmaster on week 6 of your first term. He filed it. Went back to his essay. The Halloween feast started at 6. The Great Hall was extraordinary. Harry would give Hogwarts that. It committed fully to its occasions. The pumpkins were huge and warm-glowing. The bats were real and moved in living swooping arcs through the upper darkness of the bewitched ceiling, which had gone full Halloween dramatic purple-black. The food was, as always, enormous and specific, roast meats and baked things and the specific warm spiced desserts that had no equivalent in Harry's prior experience because the Dursleys had never celebrated Halloween, or any holiday that would have required acknowledging Harry's existence within the domestic occasion. He ate with attention and genuine pleasure and tried not to make a thing of the fact that he was, right now, sitting at a feast on October 31st eating roast chicken with 3 people who had decided to know him. Ron was arguing cheerfully with Percy about whether the Gryffindor Quidditch team's current lineup made strategic sense. Hermione was eating neatly and had a book in her bag that she was very determinedly not reaching for because they were at the feast, and reaching for it would be a social wrong she'd read about in Hogwarts, a history chapter on communal dining customs. Neville was working his way through a piece of pie with focused appreciation. Harry was going to miss the end of the feast. He felt his magic do the small warming thing it had been doing in the weeks since the recalibration, not alarmed, not urgent, just aware. Paying attention to something. He looked around the hall. Nothing obvious. The noise and warmth and firelight of 500 people eating. The usual hall. He looked at the staff table, McGonagall talking to Flitwick, Dumbledore in his usual contemplative feast mode, Snape. Snape was looking at Quirrell, which was itself interesting, but Snape often looked at Quirrell in the specific way of someone keeping something under observation. Quirrell wasn't at the table. He scanned again. Quirrell's seat was empty. Harry looked at the doors of the Great Hall. Closed. Then they opened. Quirrell came in at a run, actually running, which nobody did in the Great Hall, which produced the instant collective attention that anything sufficiently out of place produces. He was pale. Genuinely pale, not the performing nervousness pale he did in class. His turban was slightly askew. His hands were shaking. He grabbed the edge of the nearest table, looked up at the high table, and said, in a voice that was also genuinely not his classroom voice, too high, too fast, the stammer entirely absent in the way the stammer is always absent when something real is happening. Troll. In the dungeons. Thought you ought to know. He fainted. For a half-second the hall held a truly extraordinary quality of collective human stillness, the kind that exists only in the moment between hearing something and processing it, and then chaos. Dumbledore was on his feet, wand raised, and the noise that came from it was not loud but was penetrating in the way that very particular spells are designed to be. Bang! Every head in the hall. Silence. Prefects, Dumbledore said. Lead your houses back to their dormitories. Teachers, with me. Do not panic. Move quickly. The hall became organized movement. Percy, instantly in his element, was on his feet and commanding the Gryffindors with the volume and purpose of a boy who had been preparing for exactly this scenario since he received his prefect badge. Follow me, everyone, quickly, stay together, do not run. Harry got up. Looked at his friends. Hermione, Ron said, realization crossing his face. She went to the bathroom. Before the feast. She was already, she doesn't know, Neville said. Harry was already moving. Not running, walking fast through the edge of the crowd going the other way, against the current. Ron fell in beside him without discussion. Neville a step behind, which Harry noted and registered as Neville choosing, clearly and without being asked. Where does she go? Harry said. Girls' bathroom on the second floor, Ron said. I said something at Charms this morning and she went at lunch and Parvati said she was crying and He stopped. I didn't mean to make her cry. I was just saying you were both insufferable but I wasn't trying to, later, Harry said. They hit the first staircase. The corridors were clearing fast as students funneled toward their common rooms, the whole castle narrowing down to moving clusters of people going the right direction. The three of them were going the wrong direction and nobody was stopping them because in the organized chaos of an evacuation, 3 students moving against traffic register as someone else's problem. Harry's magic was warm and steady. Present. Not alarmed in the sharp way of something dangerous imminent, but alert, the way you are alert when you know something is close. He tracked it without looking at it directly, the same way you track a sound you're trying to locate. Second floor corridor. The bathroom was at the far end, past the tapestry, left turn. They heard it before they saw it. Not the troll. A girl's voice. Not screaming, she hadn't started screaming yet. It was more like a single startled sound cut off, the kind that means someone has gone past surprised into a frozen place. They ran. The bathroom door was ajar. Harry hid it open and saw, the troll was 12 feet tall, greenish-gray, and occupied approximately half the available space in the girls' bathroom. It smelled like something had been left to rot in standing water for several months and had only recently been persuaded to go for a walk. It had a club, a solid piece of stone the size of Harry that it was swinging with the rhythmic thoughtless force of something that has no conception of the things it is destroying, only the destroying. Hermione was against the far wall, backed into the corner between two sinks, knees slightly bent, hands gripping the sink edge, white-faced. Not screaming, which Harry registered in the separate processing part of his brain as Hermione making a decision under pressure. Too frightened to scream. Too stubborn to collapse. Her eyes found Harry's in the door frame and something in her face shifted, not relief exactly, because relief was premature, but something that knew the situation had changed. The troll hadn't seen them yet. Its attention was on the sink it was trying to pull from the wall, because a sink had done something to offend it. Harry assessed the room in the 2 seconds he had before the assessment window closed. 1 troll. 12 feet. Club. Stone construction. 3 wands, 2.5 terms of training between them. Hermione couldn't reach the door without going past the troll. His magic was warm and vast, and it had been settling into him for 7 weeks now, learning its own reach, and the warm vast thing of it was paying extremely close attention. Neville, Harry said very quietly. Distract it. Neville looked at the troll. Looked at Harry. Looked at the troll again. How? Make noise. Far side. Then when it turns, move. And then what? Ron said. Then I'll handle it, Harry said. Handle it how? Harry looked at him. Go. Ron went. Neville went. They split right and left, and Neville made a noise. It was not a confident noise, it was the noise of a boy who is terrified and doing it anyway, which was actually better because it was real and the troll turned toward real, and the troll turned. Which meant its back was to Harry. Harry walked into the bathroom, raised his wand, and pointed it at the troll. He had been learning magic for 7 weeks. What he'd been taught so far included basic levitation, a simple illumination charm, first principles of transfiguration theory, and the absolute basics of barrier charms. None of this was sufficient for a 12-foot mountain troll. He was not working with what he'd been taught. He was working with 7 weeks of magic that had been expanded from something long compressed into something that had no precise assessment of its own edges yet, and that right now, pointed at a troll that was between him and a girl backed against a wall who had been crying in a bathroom because of something Ron had said, was operating with the calm focused certainty of a river that has found the lowest point and gone toward it. He thought stop. Not a spell. Not an incantation. Just the intention, directed through the wand with the full weight of what had been opened 7 weeks ago on a stone floor in the great hall. The troll stopped. Not slowly. Not gradually. Stopped. Mid-swing, mid-lurch, club raised above its head, feet planted on the stone floor, frozen in place with the absolute completeness of something that has been told very clearly by something much larger than itself that it is done moving now. The bathroom was very quiet. Ron stared. His mouth was slightly open. Neville looked at Harry with an expression that had gone past surprise into something that was trying to find a larger category. Hermione straightened up from the wall. She was trembling slightly, the adrenaline working through her body catching up to what had just happened. Her eyes moved from the frozen troll to Harry standing in the middle of the bathroom with his wand pointed and his expression absolutely level, and she opened her mouth. Are you all right? Harry asked. She closed her mouth. Blinked. Yes. Yes, I think so. Good. He looked at the troll. Thought for a moment. Then he looked at his wand. Back at the troll. Ron, he said. Wingardium Leviosa. The club. Take it up as high as the ceiling, then drop it. Ron understood immediately. He aimed at the club with the focused urgency of someone who has not yet fully processed what they just saw but understands that now is not the time to process it. Wingardium Leviosa. The club rose. Smooth arc, better than anything Ron had managed in class. Stress, Harry thought, was occasionally clarifying. The club went up, hit the ceiling, and Ron let it drop. It came down on the troll's head with the specific quality of sound that extremely dense objects make when they meet other extremely dense objects, and the troll collapsed sideways with a floor-shaking impact that sent the mirror above the sink swaying on its bracket. The holding spell released with the troll's unconsciousness. Harry lowered his wand. The bathroom smelled worse now. The troll was taking up nearly all the floor space, out cold, its club beside it in 2 pieces. Water was dripping somewhere. One of the sinks the troll had been assaulting was, in fact, off the wall. Neville let out a very long breath. Right, Ron said in the voice of someone who has successfully located the far side of something terrifying. That was. The bathroom door came open and 3 teachers came in. McGonagall first, her face set in the expression of someone moving very fast through a dangerous castle and ready for whatever she found. Snape behind her, wand drawn, his face the controlled calculation of a man in operational mode. Quirrell last, back on his feet, which Harry noted, turban slightly askew still, hovering at the door with wide eyes. McGonagall surveyed the scene. The troll. The destroyed sink. The 4 first-years standing in the wreckage. Harry with his wand still in his hand. Her expression moved through several things quickly. What? She said with a precision that was the verbal equivalent of a controlled detonation. Happened here? Silence. Harry looked at the troll. Back at McGonagall. We came to find Hermione, he said. She didn't know about the troll. When we got here, the troll had already cornered her. We dealt with it. You dealt with it, McGonagall said, looking at the 12-foot unconscious troll. Ron did the final spell, Harry said. Ron looked at him. Something moved across Ron's face, a complex thing, the recognition of what Harry had just done, which was not giving Ron the kill shot out of disinterest, but out of the specific understanding that Ron needed to have done something real tonight. The levitation charm, Ron said. I levitated the club onto its head. McGonagall looked at the club. At the troll. At the ceiling. Made the geometric calculation that told her the trajectory was exactly what Ron had described. I see, she said. And the troll was stopped before I did that, Ron added, with the directness of someone who is not going to lie to a teacher even when the truth is more complicated. Harry did something. It just stopped. McGonagall looked at Harry. Harry looked back. Snape was very still. His eyes were on Harry with the focused attention that Harry had become familiar with since potions on day 1, that watchful, assessing quality that had shifted, gradually, over the past 7 weeks from something with an edge in it to something more like the attention of someone who has been revising a prior theory, and is still doing the math. He stopped a troll, Neville said from the side of the room, helpfully and unnecessarily. Thank you, Neville, Harry said. Sorry. Hermione had gathered herself fully now, the trembling was gone, the color coming back. She stood straight, hands steady, and looked at McGonagall with the expression of someone who has been involved in something she knows is not the way the evening was supposed to go, and is choosing not to pretend otherwise. They came back for me, she said. I could have been seriously hurt. They came back. A pause. That was brave. McGonagall absorbed this. The room. The evidence. For first years, a destroyed bathroom, an unconscious troll. The mathematics of what had actually happened here. 50 points to Gryffindor, she said. For exceptional resourcefulness and courage in a genuine crisis. She paused. And 5 points from each of you for leaving the feast without authorization. She looked at the 4 of them. Do not look triumphant. Go to the common room. Now. They went. The corridor outside was empty, the castle having efficiently redistributed its students, and the 4 of them walked back toward Gryffindor Tower in the specific aftermath quiet of people who have just been through something together, and are still calibrating. Ron said, after a full corridor's worth of silence. You stopped a troll. Yes, Harry said. With your mind? With my wand, Harry said. An intention. You said stop and a troll stopped. More or less. Ron looked at him for a long moment. Then, That was brilliant. You did the final spell perfectly, Harry said. Under pressure, first time without practice. That's not nothing. Ron's ears went red in the way they did when something mattered and he didn't know what to do with it. Right, he said. Well, Hermione, on Harry's other side, had been quiet since the corridor. She had the particular quality of silence that meant she was organizing a very large number of things into their correct order before she spoke. When she did speak, it was carefully, and not what any of them were expecting. I owe Ron an apology, she said. Ron looked at her. What? This morning. You said we were both insufferable. I went to the bathroom and cried about it. She paused. That's my problem, not yours. You were joking and I took it wrong and I spent the whole day in my own head about it instead of just talking to you, and that was stupid, and I nearly got killed by a troll because of it, which is not your fault but is an excellent argument for not letting small things become large ones unnecessarily. Ron stared at her for a moment. I genuinely wasn't trying to, I know, she said. I know that now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry too, Ron said. I should have. He stopped. You're actually brilliant, for what it's worth. Both of you. It was a stupid thing to say. It was slightly accurate, Hermione said, and for the first time that evening there was something in her voice that was very nearly a smile. Ron laughed. Actual laugh, the full open kind, sudden and surprised. And Neville, who had not said anything since he stopped a troll, laughed too, shorter and quieter, and Harry looked at the four of them in the corridor outside the fat lady portrait and thought, this is what it is. This was the thing that happened on the other side of ordinary, extraordinary circumstances producing something that otherwise would have taken months of careful proximity to build. They had faced a troll together on Halloween, and come out the other side, and the coming out the other side had done something irreversible to the space between them. He filed it under things that mattered. They climbed through the portrait hole into the common room, which erupted in questions from the assembled Gryffindors who had been waiting and worrying and had clearly exhausted their patience for both. What Harry didn't see, because he was already through the portrait hole, Snape standing in the corridor outside the bathroom after the others had gone, while McGonagall supervised the removal of the troll. Standing very still with his arms folded and his face doing the thing it did when he was working through something. Quirrell had been the first one down the corridor. Quirrell had been the one who released the troll, Snape was almost certain of that, had gone to the third-floor corridor to check something and found a door ajar that shouldn't have been, had come back to find chaos, was building the picture with the pieces he had. He knew there was something in the third-floor corridor. He'd been suspicious of Quirrell since before term started. He'd been watching. He'd also seen what Harry had done to the troll. Not a spell. Not something with a name, anything in any textbook, any classification he had for first-year magic or third-year magic, or indeed any magic he had a precise category for. The boy had stopped it. With a look and a thought, and something that came from the opened, decompressed, vast and currently unsealing magic of a child who had spent 10 years compressed into a cupboard. Snape thought about this. He thought about James Potter, which he couldn't help, the reflex of it, thought about him, and then deliberately set him aside, because that was old business and this was something else. James Potter had been talented in the theatrical way of someone who knew they were talented. What the boy in the bathroom had done, he'd done with the quality of absolute practicality. Not looking to be seen doing it. Just doing it, because the situation required it and the magic was there. He thought about the hat's voice in the Great Hall. About a man who called this child a freak. About still came here hoping. He unfolded his arms. Started toward his office. In the morning, he was going to give a potions lesson that was demanding and exacting and took no prisoners and expected the highest quality work from every student in the room. He was going to mark it honestly. He was going to return Harry Potter's essay with the marginal notes it deserved and the grade it had earned, which was an outstanding, because it was, and because pretending otherwise had never been the thing he prided himself on. He was going to do this not because he liked the boy. Not because he owed him something. Because the boy was exceptional and the subject was his, and his subject did not lie. That was enough. Dumbledore sat in his office after midnight. The castle was quiet in the way it got after significant events, a hell-breath quality, settling. He had received Snape's full report about the third-floor corridor and Quirrell and the door left ajar. He had the pieces assembled in the picture he'd been building since summer, since the break-in at Gringotts in July, since the stone had been moved here. He knew what was in the corridor, what Quirrell was after, and roughly for whom. What he hadn't fully known, what tonight had clarified with startling completeness, was Harry. He'd known the boy was extraordinary. He'd felt the magic at the sorting, had been feeling it in steady increments since, the way you feel weather building. But the troll, Minerva's account of the bathroom, Snape's account, the converging picture of an 11-year-old who had walked into a room with a mountain troll and issued a nonverbal, non-incantational absolute stop command and had it obeyed, that was not the ordinary extraordinary. That was not even the extraordinary extraordinary. That was something he didn't have a precedent for in 50 years of teaching and the decades of his own practice before that. He thought about the stone in the third-floor corridor. About what was coming. About the plan he'd constructed. That Voldemort would come for the stone, that Harry would be drawn in, that the experience would forge something in the boy that the boy needed to be forged. He sat with that plan. He had been wrong before about what Harry needed. Wrong in ways that had cost the boy 10 years. He thought about Harry in the hospital wing. You made a choice without asking me or thinking about what it would be like. He thought about Harry in the conference room, looking at Fudge with the specific calm of someone who has decided they are not available to be managed. I'm not interested in sensitive. He thought about the troll. The plan he'd constructed relied on Harry being in a particular position, not knowing what he was walking into, not being prepared, being shaped by the experience of the encounter rather than the information before it. That was the plan he'd have made for a different boy. A boy who needed the shaping. Harry Potter, it was becoming clear, did not need to be shaped by crises he'd been kept ignorant of. He was already shaped. The cupboard had done the shaping, and the sorting had released it, and 7 weeks of Hogwarts had let it find its edges. And what it was shaping into was something that did not need to be managed or protected or kept in the dark for its own good. What it needed was information. And allies. And perhaps, on this one thing, for him to make a different kind of choice. He reached for a piece of parchment. He began to write. Harry woke up on November 1st feeling the specific clear quality of the morning after something that mattered. Not heavy. Not dramatic. Just clear. The way air is clear after real rain. On his bedside table was a letter in Dumbledore's handwriting. He looked at it for a moment before opening it, taking in the seal, the quality of the parchment, the fact that it had been delivered in the night. He opened it. It was not long. It said, Harry, there is something in this castle that I have kept from you because I believe the keeping was a form of protection. I have been reconsidering this belief. Come to my office after breakfast. Bring your friends if you like. There are things you should know. Albus Dumbledore P.S. I find that lemon drops are most effective before difficult conversations. I will have some available. Harry read it twice. Folded it. Put it in his bag. He got up. Dressed. Went to wake Ron, who was not easily woken but who, when Harry held the letter in front of his face, opened his eyes, read it, and was sitting up in 4 seconds. Bring your friends, Ron said. Yes. Ron looked at Neville's curtain. Back at Harry. All of us? All of us, Harry said. Ron pulled back Neville's curtain without ceremony. Neville. Get up. We've got a meeting with Dumbledore. Neville opened his eyes. Looked at Ron. Looked at Harry. Before breakfast? During breakfast, Harry said. We'll eat in his office. Neville sat up with the equanimity of someone who has decided, somewhere around week 3 of knowing Harry Potter, that unusual mornings were simply the current texture of his life. All right, he said. They went to get Hermione. Chapter 6. What comes after silence? Dumbledore's office smelled of old paper and something faintly sweet, like wood polish and a fire that had been burning long enough to mellow into warmth rather than heat. The stairs that spiraled up to it were stone like everything else in the castle, but moved with a smoothness that felt deliberate, as though the architecture understood that the headmaster's office was a place people arrived at with things on their minds and didn't need the additional complication of stairs that required active management. Harry went up first. Ron, Hermione, Neville behind him in a cluster that had the quality of something decided rather than something assembled. 4 people who had chosen each other, which was different from 4 people who had ended up in the same place. The office was circular and full of things. Not cluttered. There was a distinction, Harry thought, between a room full of objects placed randomly and a room full of objects each placed with specific intention. Every surface held something that looked back at you. Instruments Harry didn't have names for yet, silver and spinning gently, their purposes entirely unreadable. Portraits of past headmasters lined the walls, several of them apparently asleep, 2 watching the new arrivals with frank curiosity. Fawkes the Phoenix sat on his perch in the corner and regarded the 4 of them with an eye that was amber and ancient, and suggested he had seen a great many first-year students come through this office and found them all, without exception, interesting. Dumbledore was behind his desk with a plate of toast and a pot of tea and the lemon drops, as promised, in a small dish near his elbow. He looked at the 4 of them coming in, and whatever expression crossed his face was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Sit, please," he said. "There's food. Tea if you want it. I recommend the lemon drops, but I acknowledge this is a minority position." They sat. Ron reached for the toast with the directness of someone who had decided that if Dumbledore was offering toast, then toast was the correct thing to be doing. Hermione folded her hands in her lap. Neville looked at the portraits. Harry looked at Dumbledore. "Thank you for coming," Dumbledore said, which he said to all 4 of them, but which landed mainly between himself and Harry, as the response to the letter rather than the morning's general invitation. "I want to begin by saying that what I tell you this morning I am telling you because I believe you have earned the right to know it, and because I have, recently, begun to understand that withholding information from people who are capable of handling it is not a form of protection. It is a form of control. I have not always been clear on that distinction." He paused. "I am working on it." He said this with the specific quality of a man who has made this acknowledgement in private several times and is making it aloud for the first time, which gave it a weight that wasn't performance. It landed as true. Harry nodded. "What's in the 3rd floor corridor?" Dumbledore looked at him. "Snape's report was that detailed, was it?" "Snape's report was about Quirrell. I've been watching Quirrell since week 3. Harry looked at the headmaster directly. "Something wrong lives in him. Not the man himself, something else. In the back. Behind the turban." He paused. "And the corridor is where he's been trying to get to. So what's there?" The office was very quiet for a moment. Hermione had gone still with the quality of someone whose mind is running very fast through everything she knows and arranging it into new shapes. Ron had set down the toast. Neville was watching Dumbledore with the steady, unshocked attention of someone who has been half expecting this conversation for a while without knowing why. "The Philosopher's Stone," Dumbledore said. He told them. Not the careful parceled version of someone managing what they reveal, but the full architecture. Nicholas Flamel, the stone, the break-in at Gringotts in July when Hagrid had emptied the vault had been emptied the same day, the stone moved here. The protections in the corridor, Fluffy the 3-headed dog, and several others below. What the stone could do in the wrong hands. He told them about Voldemort. Not the comfortable version. Not the story as it had been told to Harry second-hand through Hagrid's excited retelling and the peripheral knowledge of a wizarding world that preferred not to say the name. The real version, what Voldemort had been, what he had done, how he had been stopped, and what Dumbledore believed was happening now. "He is not gone," Dumbledore said. "What happened on the night your parents died, the curse reflected, it destroyed his body but not the thing he had made of himself. He has been surviving. On the edges. In hosts." He looked at Harry. "I believe Quirrell is one of them." Harry thought about Quirrell's face, the one behind the classroom face. The smell. The hand moving to the back of the turban. He's on the back of his head, he said. Dumbledore looked at him with that particular quality of attention. What makes you say that? The hand gesture. He keeps checking. Like something back there. And the turban. Harry paused. The turban is facing the wrong direction. The thick part should be at the front of a properly wound turban. His is at the back. Hermione drew a short breath. He's been walking around with Voldemort on the back of his head all term. All term, Dumbledore confirmed. And Voldemort needs the stone to restore himself fully. The protections below should hold indefinitely, but... He stopped. But indefinitely is not the same as forever, and I have reason to believe the timeline is accelerating. Why are you telling us now? Neville asked. Quiet and direct. Dumbledore looked at him. Because last night, Mr. Longbottom, Harry stopped a mountain troll with an act of intentional magic that I cannot fully classify. And because when I reviewed what I knew of this situation in light of that, I found that my original plan for how this would resolve was based on a model of Harry that no longer corresponds to reality. A pause. My original plan involved Harry encountering this at the appropriate time, in the appropriate circumstances, and being shaped by the experience in ways I thought necessary. You were going to let me walk into it, Harry said. Not accusing. Just finishing the sentence. Yes. Without knowing what it was. Yes. And now you're not going to do that. No, Dumbledore said. I'm not. Harry looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Fawkes made a small sound on his perch, a low musical note, almost like punctuation. Okay, Harry said. Then tell us the rest of the protections. Dumbledore blinked. Just slightly. It was, Harry had noticed, the Dumbledore equivalent of a dramatic reaction. You want to go down there? Hermione said to Harry, not as a question. I want to understand it, Harry said. What's there, how it works, what Quirrell needs to get through it. If he's going to make a move, I want to know the terrain. Harry, Dumbledore said. This is not something I intend to ask you to handle. You're not asking, Harry said. I'm asking you. Tell me what's down there. A pause. And then decide whether you want me going in prepared or going in blind. Because I'm going either way. The silence that followed was not a shocked silence. It was a recalibration silence, the sound of a very intelligent old man updating the model he had for the person sitting across from him. The protections, Dumbledore said, are as follows. He described them: Fluffy, the three-headed dog, knocked out by music. Devil's Snare, Sprout's contribution, vulnerable to light and warmth. Flying Keys, Flittix. A life-size chess set, McGonagall's, the most physically demanding. A troll already defeated. A logic puzzle with potions, Snape's, requiring analytical thinking. And beyond all of that, the Mirror of Erised, moved to the final chamber, used as the last protection. The stone hidden within it, visible only to someone who wanted to find it but not use it. Harry listened to all of it. Made no notes. His memory, sharpened by years of needing to remember things without being permitted to write them down, caught and held every detail. When Dumbledore finished, Harry nodded once. The mirror, he said. That's the key one. Everything else is an obstacle, but the mirror is the actual protection. Yes, Dumbledore said. And Voldemort can't use it himself because he wants to use the stone. So he needs Quirrell to want it for him. But Quirrell can't want it for himself if Voldemort is looking through his eyes. Harry paused. So the mirror defeats them by design. Correct. Unless, Hermione said quietly, Quirrell managed to want it for himself for long enough to retrieve it. Which is why the timeline matters, Harry said. He looked at Dumbledore. When? I don't know, Dumbledore said. Soon. Days. Possibly tonight. The word landed in the room with the particular quality of things that reorient everything around them. Tonight, Brown said. Possibly. I have been watching the indications and the acceleration of certain signs. Quirrell's behavior over the past 3 days has changed. Dumbledore looked at Harry. I have sent for certain assistance, but it will not arrive until tomorrow at the earliest. Harry looked at the lemon drop dish. Back at Dumbledore. Then we should go now. Before he does. Harry, I'm not arguing, Harry said. I'm telling you what the situation is. If Quirrell goes down tonight and your assistance doesn't arrive until tomorrow, what happens to the stone? What happens to Voldemort? He met Dumbledore's eyes. I can go through those protections. All of them. You've just told me exactly what they are. You are 11 years old, Dumbledore said. I stopped a troll last night, Harry said. An 11-year-old stopping a troll isn't the reason you're worried. The reason you're worried is because the last time you put something between me and danger in the belief that it would protect me, it didn't. And you know it. The fire. The portraits. The slow spinning instruments. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a very long time, and Harry looked back, and in the silence between them 10 years of choices hung in the air and were not resolved and were not required to be resolved but were simply present. Acknowledged. Not alone. Dumbledore said finally. If you go with your friends. And you go with full knowledge of what you're facing. And I will be behind you as quickly as I can manage. Harry looked at Ron. Ron met it with the expression of someone who made his decision somewhere around the troll last night, and hasn't needed to revisit it since. He looked at Hermione, whose face was the precise controlled expression of someone who is terrified and is doing this anyway. He looked at Neville, who was looking at his hands in his lap, and then looked up, and said, I'm in. They went in the early afternoon, which felt wrong for something significant. Significance, Harry had noticed, was supposed to arrive at dramatic hours, midnight or dawn, but actually made sense because the corridors were full of students and teachers during afternoon lessons, and a group of 4 first-years moving through the castle attracted less attention than they would have at night. The 3rd-floor corridor was locked, which stopped nothing. Harry's wand was in his hand and the magic moved through the lock like it was asking rather than forcing. The lock simply acquiesced, and the door opened onto the smell of animal and straw and something very large breathing in the dark. Hermione produced her wand and Lumos lit the room. Fluffy occupied most of it. 3 heads, each roughly the size of a cart horse, all 3 currently awake and all 3 immediately aware of the door opening. The sound it produced, a 3-way, overlapping growl that resonated in the sternum rather than the ear, was the kind of sound that communicated very clearly that the next 2 seconds were going to define whether you lived or died. Harry didn't hesitate. He drew on the magic, the full loose warm reach of it, and thought of sleep. Not a spell. An intention. The same principle as the troll, applied with slightly more specificity, directed at the 3-headed dog rather than generally, shaped around the concept of sleep the way a river shapes around an obstacle, following the path of least resistance through the enormous simple brain of something that had 3 of everything and was therefore, in some ways, easier rather than harder. The left head went first. The middle a second later. The right blinked several times, clearly fighting it, and then subsided. 3 heads down. The growling stopped. You did it again, Ron said. It's still easier than explaining, Harry said. Hermione was already looking at the trapdoor under Fluffy's feet. 1 paw overlapping the edge. She bent, assessed the geometry, and said, If we can shift his left paw slightly on it, Neville said, and cast a gentle Wingardium Leviosa on the paw, which moved enough for Hermione to get the trapdoor open. Dark below. The smell of earth and green. Devil's snare, Hermione said immediately, to Ron's querying look. Don't fight it. Go limp. I'll handle the light. She went first. Which surprised Ron and then didn't because Hermione, when she knew what she was doing, did not wait for permission. Harry followed. Ron. Neville last. The drop was long enough to be alarming. The devil's snare caught them all in the specific way of something designed to do that, thin tendrils wrapping with the professional efficiency of a plant that had one job. Harry went limp, let it work on him, trusted the physics of it. Beside him he heard Hermione's voice, steady and focused, Lumos Maxima, and the light she produced was not the small illumination spell from charms but something broader, warmer, and the devil's snare retreated with the urgency of something that had a strong opinion about light and was acting on it. They dropped out of the plant's reach onto solid ground. Dark tunnel. Stone floor. Moving air from somewhere ahead. Everyone intact? Harry said. 3 affirmatives. Right. He lit his wand and started forward. The flying keys were Flitwick's, and they were beautiful in the way that traps sometimes are, hundreds of winged keys filling a chamber that also contained 4 broomsticks, the keys wheeling through the air in the complex overlapping patterns of something designed to make finding one specific key in the mass of them feel impossible. Harry found the right broomstick immediately, not the newest, not the most obvious, the one with a slightly worn handle grip and the balance of something built for real use rather than display, and was on it, and in the air in a single motion. He found the key in 40 seconds. It was old, large, one wing bent from being caught before. He recognized it because it was moving differently from the others, not randomly, the way free keys might, but with the specific pattern of something that had been caught and bent and was now compensating. He tracked its arc, read the pattern, went wide and came at it from the direction it couldn't compensate toward and closed his hand around it. On the ground, Ron was watching with his mouth slightly open. You are going to be the youngest Quidditch player in a century, Ron said. Later, Harry said. Door. The chess set was McGonagall's and it was magnificent and impassable by normal means. The pieces were the height of adults, marble and obsidian, and they stood on their squares with the absolute commitment of things built for exactly one purpose. The board was enormous, stretching the full width of the chamber, with no path around it. Hermione looked at the board. Harry looked at the board. Ron looked at the board and something happened in his face. A settling, a recognition, the quality of someone who has arrived at the thing they are specifically built for. He stepped forward. I've got this one, Ron said. Ron, I know chess, Ron said. He said it not with bravado but with the simple certainty of someone stating a relevant qualification. I have always known chess. This is... He studied the board for a moment, tracking pieces, reading lines, the way Harry had read the flying keys pattern. This is actually a classical King's Gambit setup. I know this board. He looked at Harry. Trust me. Harry stepped back. Ron directed the game. He was methodical and fast, calling pieces forward with the authority of someone who has played enough chess that the pieces seemed to understand they were being managed by a genuine player rather than someone attempting to appear competent. Pieces moved. Exchanges were made. Ron sacrificed a bishop deliberately and without sentiment. He sacrificed a rook. He looked at the board and then at Harry with an expression that was clear-eyed and resolved. I need to take the knight's position, he said. It's the only move that opens the path. It means I'll get taken. Ron, Hermione said. I'll be fine. It's chess. The pieces here are replaced, they're not actually. They'll take me off the board, I'll be knocked out for a bit, but the path will be open. He paused. It's the right move. Harry looked at him. Are you sure? Completely, Ron said. He moved to the knight's square. The opposing queen turned toward him, and before anyone could respond she swept toward him with the full force of enchanted marble, and Ron went down, hard, and the path opened up. Hermione made a sound and moved toward him. He's breathing, Harry said, already reading it from the rise and fall. He's okay. Hermione. She stopped. Looked at Harry. Her eyes were bright. Go, she said. I'll stay with him. Neville and we'll stay with him. The last room, you don't need 3 people for Snape's logic puzzle, Hermione said. She pulled herself together with the speed of someone who has decided what's necessary and acted on the decision. You need one person who can read a logic puzzle and you are that person. Go. Neville moved to Ron's other side. He didn't say anything. He just went there. Harry looked at the 3 of them. At Ron unconscious and breathing. At Hermione steady. At Neville, who had been steadily making himself essential since the night of the troll and apparently had no intention of stopping. "I'll be quick," Harry said. "Be careful," Neville said. "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive." Harry went through the door. The room with the potions was cold and dark, and the flames at the door and the door ahead blocked any direction except thought. 7 bottles on a table. A rolled parchment beside them was Snape's handwriting, small, precise, the hand he'd learned to recognize from essays returned with marginal notes. He picked up the parchment and read it. Logic puzzle, as described. The clues built systematically to an answer with the specific elegant construction of someone who genuinely believed that intelligence was the most reliable protection. Harry read it through once, read it through again, saw the shape of the answer, looked at the 7 bottles. He picked up the bottle containing the potion that would let him through the black flames ahead. It was small, barely a mouthful. He thought about Snape for a moment. About the marginal notes on his essays. About outstanding, see note on paragraph 3. About the way Snape had said fame is not entirely incompatible with literacy, and in saying it had been, functionally, trying to pick a fight he'd already half decided not to have. About a teacher who was difficult and demanding and exact, and who had spent 6 weeks revising something about the way he saw Harry, visibly, in real time. He drank the potion. Stepped through the flames. The final chamber was small. The mirror of Eris stood against the far wall, its frame carved with the inscription that Dumbledore had told him about, Eris stra erat oit ube cafra oit an wosi, the reversed words of desire. It reflected the room. It reflected Harry. And in front of it stood Quirrell. Quirrell with his back to Harry, looking into the mirror with the focused desperation of a man who has been standing here for some time trying to want the right thing and finding that his wants will not cooperate. His hands were out in front of him, pressed flat to the mirror's frame, and he was talking to himself in a rapid low murmur, not to himself, Harry understood. To the things sharing his body. The conversation of a man and his occupant. "I see myself holding it," Quirrell was saying. "I see myself presenting it to you. That should be, it isn't working." The voice from the back of Quirrell's head was high and thin and had a quality that bypassed the ear and went directly into something more primitive, the part of the brain that registers genuine wrongness the way you register the smell of something dead before you've consciously identified it. "You want to give it to me. You don't want it for yourself. The mirror sees through you." Harry stood in the doorway and looked at the back of Quirrell's turban and felt his magic do something he'd never felt it do before, not warm, not the battle readiness of the troll, not the focused intentionality of the corridor. It went very still. The way things go still before a significant change in weather. The quiet before the temperature drops. He knew what that was. Some part of him, deeper than his 11 years, recognized the quality of it. He stepped into the room. Quirrell spun. The face he turned was different from the classroom face. No stammer. No anxious deference. Just the face of a man who had traveled past the point where performance served any purpose, wearing the flat, desperate expression of someone who has done irrevocable things for a promise they're not sure was worth it. "Potter," Quirrell said. "Professor," Harry said. Pleasantly. Quirrell's wand was in his hand. Harry's was in his hand. The mirror stood between them and to the side, still reflecting, still asking its question of anyone who looked. "I'm going to need you to step away from the mirror," Harry said. "And I'm going to need whatever's at the back of your head to stay quiet, if that's negotiable." "Kill him!" The thin voice from the back. Quirrell's wand came up. Harry moved sideways, not backwards, sideways, which Quirrell had not anticipated, and the spell that came from Quirrell's wand hit the chamber wall and produced a crack that ran up the stone in a jagged line. Harry's magic moved with him, not casting, not yet, still in that very still quality, watching. "You're not going to kill me," Harry said. "He can't. I've survived him once and my mother's protection is still. Your mother is dead." "Her magic isn't," Harry said. He looked at Quirrell and he looked at the mirror and he thought about what Dumbledore had told him, that the stone was visible only to someone who wanted to find it but not use it, and he understood, in one clean moment of clarity, what he needed to do. He walked to the mirror. Quirrell fired another curse. Harry's magic caught it, not with a shield charm, not with anything he'd been taught, but with the same principle he'd applied to the troll: intention, directed, absolute. The curse hit something in the air 2 feet in front of him and deflected into the floor. He looked into the mirror. He saw himself. Not the famous version, not the cover of Chocolate Frog's version, not even the Hogwarts student version. He saw himself the way he'd never quite been able to see himself before, clearly. A boy standing in a stone chamber, knowing what he was and not being afraid of it, and in his hand, in the reflection, the stone. In his actual hand, weight. Small, dense, warm. The stone had appeared in his pocket while he was looking into the mirror. He could feel it through the fabric. He turned from the mirror. Quirrell was across the room. His face had changed again. Whatever Voldemort was communicating through the back of his head was arriving at Quirrell's expression in fragments, urgency and fury in rapid alternation. "Give it to me," Quirrell said. His wand was still raised. "Give it to me and I'll let you leave. He has no quarrel with you. What happened with your parents it was nothing personal. A means to an end. You were incidental." Harry looked at him. "My parents," Harry said, "were not incidental." And then, quietly, and without particular drama, "You're not leaving this room with the stone. Whatever you need to tell yourself to make that easier to accept is your own business. Get the stone from him," said the voice from the back. "Touch him. Take it." Quirrell crossed the room in 3 strides. His hand closed around Harry's wrist. What happened next, Harry would later be unable to describe precisely. He knew what it felt like, the magic in him, that vast settled thing, responding to Voldemort's touch the way it had responded to the Sorting Hat's touch, but differently. That had been a release. This was the opposite. A tightening, a concentration, every opened and recalibrated and released piece of 10 years of magical pressure suddenly directed outward through the one point of contact. Quirrell screamed. He let go. Stumbled back. His hand, where he had grabbed Harry's wrist, was wrong. The skin was wrong. He grabbed Harry again, both hands this time, trying to get at the pocket, and Harry's magic responded with the complete absence of hesitation that very large things have when they have decided. The pain in Quirrell's face was instantaneous and total. He released Harry. Fell back. The chamber wall was behind him, and he went against it, and slid down it, and his hands were burned, not by fire, but by something the burn carried in it that fire didn't. Something that was specifically antagonistic to the thing sharing his body. "Stop." The thin voice was different now. Higher. More urgent. Less certain. "Stop. Let me, I can still." The turban was coming undone. Harry stood in the middle of the chamber, and watched, and did not look away. He had been told, years from now he would understand he had been told by the oldest part of himself, to look directly at this and not flinch, because flinching was for things that deserved to diminish you, and this was not one of those things. The face on the back of Quirrell's head was terrible, and small, and wrong in the way that things are wrong when they have been made wrong by choices rather than chance. It looked at Harry with eyes that had no whites in them. "Harry Potter," it said. "Not tonight," Harry said. He raised his wand. He did not know any spell that addressed this specific situation. He did not need one. He drew on the magic, the full, loose, warm vasting of it. 10 years of compressed silence finally learned into its own shape, and he directed it at the face on the back of Quirrell's head with the simple, focused intention of someone who has been told what they are, and has decided that what they are is not afraid. The magic that came out of his wand was not a color he had a name for. Voldemort screamed. Not Quirrell. Quirrell had already lost consciousness. The thing in Quirrell, the remnant, the fragment of a man who had made himself monstrous through choices made over years, screamed with the sound of something being denied something it had been building toward for a very long time. And then it came apart. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have satisfied a story that wanted spectacle. It came apart the way a lie comes apart when the truth is said clearly, simply, completely, without the possibility of reconstruction. It was there, and then it was not there, and the chamber was just a chamber with a stone floor and a mirror and an unconscious man and Harry Potter standing in the middle of it, breathing normally, the stone worm in his pocket. He stood there for a moment. Then he sat down on the floor, which seemed like the sensible thing to do, and waited. Dumbledore arrived in 12 minutes. Harry had counted. He came through the door from the potions room, which meant he'd come through the trapdoor, through the devil's snare, through the keys, through the chess game, and he moved with the controlled urgency of someone who has been running and is managing the fact of having been running. His robes were slightly disordered. His hat was gone. He saw Harry sitting cross-legged on the floor of the chamber with his wand across his knees and Quirrell unconscious against the wall. He stopped. "The stone," Harry said, and took it out of his pocket and held it up. Dumbledore crossed the room and took it from Harry's hand, and looked at it, and looked at Quirrell, and looked at Harry. His face had that quality it got sometimes, the one that wasn't quite any single expression but was the result of too many things arriving simultaneously to sort into individual responses. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No. Quirrell, alive. Unconscious. Whatever was in him." Harry paused. "It's gone. I don't think it's destroyed. I think it left. But it's not in him anymore." Dumbledore looked at Quirrell, made an assessment with his wand that took about 15 seconds and which his face read carefully. "Yes," he said. It's gone." A pause. "Harry, what did you, my magic?" Harry said simply. "I directed it. Like with the troll, but more." "More," Dumbledore said. "There was a lot of it," Harry said. Dumbledore sat down in the only chair in the room, which was one of those things that made you wonder whether certain chairs appeared in certain places precisely when someone needed to sit down. He sat. He looked at the stone in his hand. He looked at Harry. "I owe you," he said, "an accounting. You can start with why there's a philosopher's stone hidden in a school full of children," Harry said. "But not tonight. Tonight I want to know Ron's all right." "Mr. Weasley is fine," Dumbledore said. "I passed him on the way through. He was being lectured by Miss Granger and eating a piece of chocolate, which I provided, and he had the expression of a boy who is slightly concussed but fundamentally intact." "And Neville," Harry said, "sitting beside Mr. Weasley and telling Miss Granger that she needed to eat her chocolate too." A pause. "It appears Mr. Longbottom has a talent for being exactly what the situation requires." Harry looked at the mirror of Erised, still standing at the far wall. Still reflecting. He didn't look at his own reflection, he looked at Dumbledore's, and saw there a man who was very old and very tired and who had made a great many decisions over a very long life, some of them right and some of them catastrophically wrong, and who was sitting in a stone chamber at whatever hour of the afternoon this was, reckoning with the scale of what the 11-year-old across from him had just accomplished. "Professor," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "I want you to be honest with me. From now on." Harry met his eyes. "About all of it. What's coming, what you know, what you're planning. Not because I need you to make every decision with me. Because I work better with information than without it, and we both know that now." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not the theatrical pause of a man collecting a prepared response but the genuine stillness of someone considering an offer that has real weight. "Yes," he said. "That seems, yes." Another pause. "I should tell you that Voldemort is not finished. What you did tonight, what happened to him, it has pushed him further back. But the soul fragment, the remnant, it will find another way. Other hosts. He has been diminished, not ended." "I know," Harry said. "The prophecy." Dumbledore stared at him. "What do you know about the prophecy?" "Nothing specific," Harry said. "But there has to be one. He came for my parents specifically. He came for me specifically. You don't do that without a reason, and wizards of his type don't act on feeling, they act on information. There's something that makes me specifically the person who has to deal with this. He looked at Dumbledore directly. I'd like to know what it says. A very long silence. You will, Dumbledore said finally. Not tonight. You are 11 years old and you have just done something extraordinary, and tonight you should eat and sleep and let your friends be relieved that you're alive. But you will know. He paused. I promise. Harry looked at him. Measuring. The old familiar skill, the one you develop when you've spent 10 years reading whether the person telling you something is telling you the truth. He was telling the truth. Okay, Harry said. He stood up from the floor, brushed the stone dust off his robes, and picked up his wand. Can we go up now? Dumbledore stood as well. He looked at Quirrell one more time. The stone needs to be returned to Nicholas Flamel, he said half to himself. Quirrell will need medical care. He tucked the stone in his robes. There will need to be a great many conversations with the Ministry. Fudge will want to. Fudge can wait, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. Something moved across his face that was, unmistakably and without any of its usual complicated layering, simply fondness. Yes, he said. Fudge can wait. They came up through the trapdoor into the third-floor corridor, where evening had arrived while they'd been underground, and Hermione grabbed Harry's arm the moment he emerged from Fluffy's room with the specific grip of someone who has been sitting with a controlled, very anxious quiet for the last hour, and has now released it all into one motion. Ron was on his feet, slightly pale, with a small chocolate smear near his mouth, and Neville standing beside him in the quality that Neville had of simply being reliably present. He looked at Harry and said, Did you get it? Yes. And Voldemort? Gone. For now. Ron let out a breath that was approximately 30% of his lung capacity, and put both hands on top of his head and looked at the ceiling. Right, he said. Right, okay. Your chess was brilliant, Harry said. Ron looked at him. The familiar red ears. Anyone could have seen that move. They couldn't, Neville said quietly. I was watching. No one else could have seen that. Ron stood with that for a moment and didn't argue with it, which was a small and significant thing, Ron learning to receive a true thing without deflecting it. Harry watched it happen and filed it as something that mattered. Hermione released Harry's arm. She looked at him with the expression she got when she had run every scenario and the actual outcome had been better than the calculated probability, which was an expression she wore somewhat rarely and which, on her face, looked like relief simplified all the way to its essence. Are you actually all right? She said. Yes, he said. And then, the troll's gone from the bathroom, right? You don't need to worry about that. She stared at him. I wasn't, that's not even, Harry. I know, he said. I know. I'm fine. She looked at him for another moment, and clearly had 6 more things to say and chose, with visible effort, to say none of them right now. Later. They would all be said later. He would answer them because she asked them seriously, and he took serious things seriously, and that was the shape of it. Dumbledore moved them all out of the third-floor corridor with the gentle authority of someone who has very little left in him for complications, and is managing the last reserves. He walked them to the hospital wing, Pomfrey for Ron's concussion, all 4 of them for general check, because Pomfrey had told Harry today, immediately, and he assumed she had extended this to his general vicinity. Ron's concussion was mild. Hermione had a minor bruise from the devil's snare that she hadn't mentioned. Neville had nothing wrong with him at all, which he seemed mildly surprised by. Harry submitted to Pomfrey's diagnostic wand with the equanimity of someone who has been poked with that wand enough times in the past 7 weeks to understand that resisting it is not only futile but actively counterproductive. She read the results. Her face went through its usual sequence of focused professional interpretation and stopped at something that was, this time, not alarmed. Remarkable, she said. Good remarkable or complicated remarkable? Harry asked. Good, she said. You used a great deal of magic this afternoon, and your reserves are already restabilizing. She looked at him over her wand. Your core is not only intact. It's. She paused. I have no clinical term for it. It's larger than it was at your last check. It's been figuring out how much space it has, Harry said. Yes, she said. Precisely that. She gave them all chocolate, because chocolate was Pomfrey's conviction, and told them that dinner was in an hour and they were all going to eat it and sleep properly, and that anyone who came to her tomorrow with exhaustion symptoms because they stayed up talking all night was going to be in for a very difficult conversation. They promised they would sleep. They went to the great hall and ate dinner. The hall was, as it usually was, full and warm and loud. Harry sat between Ron and Hermione and across from Neville, and they ate the way people eat after a long day that had several things in it that could have gone differently, with attention and genuine hunger, and the specific quality of comfort that comes from ordinary food in a warm room when you have come back from somewhere cold. Across the hall, the Slytherin table did what it did. Harry registered it without dwelling on it. He noticed that Draco Malfoy, halfway down the table, looked at Harry once, a quick, assessing look, not hostile, and then looked at his plate. He noticed that several older Gryffindors had heard enough of what had happened to be giving him the specific look of people upgrading their prior assessment. He noticed that Professor McGonagall, at the high table, was eating with the quality of a woman who has been given information over the course of the afternoon that she is still organizing, and that she looked at Harry twice during the meal with an expression that he could read now well enough to know was something between pride and the complicated form of relief that comes with guilt in it. He noticed that Snape was absent from the high table and that Dumbledore ate with the tired, specific contentment of someone who has navigated a very complicated day to a better outcome than several of his backup plans had suggested was likely. He ate his dinner and thought about none of it in particular, and all of it at once in the way that happens when you've done something significant and the significance hasn't fully metabolized yet. Ron said, at some point in the middle of a second helping. So next year. What about it? Is it going to be like this? Harry considered that question. Thought about what Dumbledore had told him. Voldemort still out there, diminished but not gone, still building towards something, the prophecy still existing and its contents still unknown. Thought about the stone and the mirror and Quirrell's face. Thought about the things he knew and the things he didn't know yet, and the fact that knowing more and knowing faster had turned out to be better than the alternative. Probably, he said. Ron thought about this. Nodded with the equanimity of someone who has decided, consciously or otherwise, that the answer is acceptable. Right, he said. Good. Good? Hermione said. I mean, not good. But, Ron gestured vaguely with his fork in the direction of all four of them, and the table, and the room, and presumably the general situation. This, he said. I'm all right with this. Hermione looked at him. Then at Harry. Then at Neville, who was eating a piece of pie and who looked up and said, He's right. We're all right with this. The fire in the great hall was generous and the ceiling was doing a clear autumn night sky, the first stars appearing in the deep blue just visible at the edges of the enchanted dark, and the four of them sat at the Gryffindor table and ate and were present in the way that you learn, if you're lucky, to be present, not despite the complicated things, not after them, but right in the middle of them, with people you've chosen, in the place where you belong. Harry put his fork down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. At the stars. He thought about his parents. About Lily and James Potter, who had died on this side of October and whose deaths had made him a symbol before he was old enough to understand what a symbol was. He thought about them the way he'd been thinking about them all day, as people. Real ones. With faces that moved in photographs and history he hadn't been given yet, and a love that had done something magic on the night Voldemort came, something that even Voldemort's fragment of soul had spent 7 weeks in a stone chamber trying to get around and couldn't. He thought, I'll find out more about you. I'll ask Dumbledore. I'll ask Hagrid. I'll find everyone who knew you and I'll ask. He thought, I'm going to be okay. Not because the difficult things were over. Because he knew now what he was. Not the boy who lived, Not the name on the card or the name on the letter or the name the Sorting Hat had said in that carrying bell voice in the Great Hall on the first night. He knew the other name. The one that didn't have a title. The one that was just him. Harry. Who had been in a cupboard and come out anyway. Who had walked into a stone chamber with a troll and a mountain of magic he'd only just learned how to use, and who had sat on the floor afterward and waited for Dumbledore with the equanimity of someone who is not afraid of what they are. He looked back down from the ceiling. Ron was arguing with Hermione about Quidditch statistics. Neville was eating his pie and listening to them with the expression of someone who finds this particular argument completely predictable, and therefore deeply comfortable. The Great Hall was warm. The stars were real, outside and above. Harry picked up his fork and went back to dinner. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And the magic in him, vast, settled, finally learned into its own shape, done with silence, moved with him like something that had been waiting a very long time to simply be his. It was